We want to stop a global chain reaction.
Try to see the bigger picture, so much bigger than you and I alone. If we all just make some changes, we could be the ones to turn it all around. It's time to wise up, get our act together. This is so much more than changes in the weather. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. The time is now. Oh, oh, oh. The time is now. Best thing to do is stop deforestation, a major cause of habitat obliteration. Trees make oxygen that we need to breathe. No more trees means no more me. Time to stop burning those fossil fuels if we don't want to be fossils too. Burning fuel causes air pollution. It's time to embrace a greener solution.
Large-scale farming plays a big part. Billions of cows means a whole lot of farts.
We need change. It has to be drastic. Cut down production of single-use plastic. 3 million years human evolution. 200 years industrial pollution. One last chance for a green revolution. It's time to rise up, get our act together. This is so much more than changes in the weather. We say no, no, no more wasting time. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. It's time to rise up, get our act together. This is so much more than changes in the weather. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. And we say no, no, no more wasting time. The time is now. Oh, 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 oh. The time is now. Oh, 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 oh. The time is now. Oh, 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 oh. The time is now. Now!
Yes, you are in the right place. Do not adjust your laptops. That was the climate change song. The time is now from One More Song. And I can't think of a more uplifting way to start a conference on climate change than that. In case you're not familiar with them, One More Song are an organisation who support children's mental health through their music. And Harper Macleod are going to be making a sizable donation to the charity Child Mental Health Support Scotland, place to be, to help carry on that really important work. Did you catch the chorus there? It's time to wise up, get our act together. It's so much more than changes in the weather. No more wasting time. The time is now. I guess at a conference about renewable energy and climate change, we are preaching to the converted about the climate crisis. But that was a timely and really tuneful reminder of why we are all here. Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm welcome to you all to this virtual SHREC conference 2021. My name is Nikki Marr and I am alone here in the studio in Inverness, but by the wonders of Zoom, something which hardly any of us had even heard of this time last year, you are all at home, at your homes across Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, some of you south of the border, and lots of you, I'm delighted to say, are coming to us from right across Europe. And my co-host for today's conference, the Head of Energy and Natural Resources for Harper Macleod, is David Bone, and he is coming to us live from his home in Peebles in the Borders. Good afternoon, David. Did you enjoy our musical start to conference today?
Good afternoon, Nikki, and afternoon, everybody, and welcome to SHREC 12. It's great to be here, and yes, I did. I was just thinking while I was listening to the song that since we'll be ending this afternoon hearing the views of young people in climate change, how appropriate it was to also start with a call for action from even younger ones, given that a lot of what this conference is about today is what we can do for the next generation.
And of course, the next generation is going to be impacted an awful lot more than, without being rude, than you and I are, David. Are those kids in that song right? Is now the right time to be having this conference on climate change?
Absolutely, Nikki. I mean, this is such an exciting time for the renewables industry in general and Scotland in particular, with the need to tackle climate change now at the forefront of the global stage, and with Glasgow having an opportunity to host what will be a really critical global summit in November.
Of course, COP26 is just around the corner, and will be so much in the news about that as we run up to it. We have got an absolutely packed programme to take us through between now and about 4 o'clock. And David, you're chairing 2 of the panel sessions. Can I ask you, though, of everything that we've got to look forward to, what are you most looking forward to today?
Well, that's not fair. I'm looking forward to everything, Nikki. We have a really interesting and varied programme. We'll be hearing from the Scottish Government about their plans in the lead up to COP26. We'll be hearing about the changes that are taking place and are indeed being demanded in our attitudes to decarbonisation from campaigning groups and from young people. We'll be hearing from developers and investors about what they need to develop and finance the projects that will move us towards our goals. We'll be listening to discussion on how we can sustainably use Scotland's natural resources. And we'll also be hearing from some other countries' experiences. So it really should be a fascinating day.
It should indeed. I'm quite surprised when I look at the clock and I look at the programme about how we're going to manage to fit it all in. I don't know how we're going to manage all that, but we will certainly do that. There is loads to look forward to and loads to learn from. Now, last April's conference, SHREC 11, took place virtually because we were right at the very start of this global pandemic. And here we are again, almost exactly a year on, still virtual, but that's perhaps not such a bad thing for this conference today.
No, I mean, obviously we'll miss our annual gathering of the SHREC community in Inverness, Nikki, but every cloud has a silver lining, and holding our conference online this year, first of all, allows far more people to join us, and second, has allowed us to attract speakers based in Amsterdam, Munich and Oslo, in addition to those from all parts of Scotland and also from down south. So it gives the conference a truly international feel at a time when attracting development and investment in Scotland is vitally important.
It certainly does. And of course, it'll be really, really interesting to hear some of those different viewpoints from right across Europe. And of course, we are all just a wee bit better at using the technology than we were this time last year. So fingers crossed, everything will go well and we will get all the right speakers in all the right places at all the right times throughout today. Now, we may not be here together in person, but we are certainly here live, and we really do want and invite your interaction. At certain points throughout the day, we've set aside quite a considerable chunk of time for questions and answers. And we would love to get your input. In fact, I would probably go so far as to say we need your input, because that time will not fill itself. And if we don't have your comments and your suggestions, your ideas and your questions, your observations too, then either David or I might be forced to burst into song, and you really don't want to see that at all. So as questions occur to you throughout the day, please just get in touch. There's a little Q&A box on the webinar screen that you should be watching on, and David and I will pick them up as we go throughout the day. I've got an iPad right here in front of me. David's got his laptop too, so we will see your questions as they come in. We will put them to the panels of speakers. I'd like to ask you, though, when you are getting in touch, please give us your name, and if you are from an organisation too, then let us know where you're from and we can attribute your question accordingly. Now, of course, there might be some questions that we can't answer, either because of time constraints or because someone needs to go off and actually do some research to get the proper answer and to give that the respect it needs. So we will go through as many as we can. Any that we can't pick up or any that we don't get to, then Harper Macleod are going to collate them all, get the answers together and put them in a document which will be circulated to delegates after the conference. So hopefully no one will miss out. We've planned a lunch break for 1:30, when there's half an hour when you can either just completely switch off and go outside. It's a beautiful day here in Inverness, perfect renewable energy weather, I think. Certainly good solar power and good wind power for drying my washing today. So if you want to get a break, get outside, then feel free to do so. But if you fancy doing some informal networking with some other conference delegates, then that would be really, really welcome. It would be great to have you in those meetings. You should all have received an email just very recently, this morning perhaps, with all the information about how that works, but I will give you a reminder of that just before we break for lunch. Once we come back at 2 o'clock, there is another hour and a half of discussions and talks and panelists, panel chats, and then we will break at around about 3:30, and then the networking will continue until 4 o'clock. I think that's probably all of the housekeeping that we need to cover off before we really start this conference proper. So I will hand over to you, if I may now, David, for you to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Nikki. And yes, so I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Rosanna Cunningham, to give the keynote address. Rosanna is the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform. She has been an MP for 6 years and an MSP for the last 21 years, and currently holds a portfolio that's really vital because it's at the centre of how Scotland moves towards decarbonisation. Can I therefore invite you to listen to this recorded message, which the Cabinet Secretary has kindly provided for us.
Good morning, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. I know that SHREC has been running very successfully for many years now, and that a number of my colleagues have attended in the past. I'm pleased to join you today in what is still a difficult and anxious time for the country, but nevertheless also a critical moment in our journey to net zero. I have responsibility within government for environment, climate change and land reform, and despite the obvious, very obvious challenges of the last year, when our lives have been upended in the most unprecedented way, we have nevertheless continued to make progress in these important areas. The First Minister declared a climate emergency in May 2019, and since then, the Scottish Parliament has passed the most ambitious legislative framework for emissions reductions in the world, to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2045. Now, these commitments are underpinned, of course, by a legal commitment to a just transition where no one is left behind. And while the almost 2 years since then have not gone as any of us might have expected, we are nevertheless making progress towards these targets. We've halved our greenhouse gas emissions from the 1990 baseline, and in our Scottish Progress Report published in October last year, just 2020, our statutory advisers, the Committee on Climate Change, did note that Scotland has decarbonised more quickly than the rest of the UK and faster than any G20 economy since 2008. And they concluded emissions have fallen rapidly while the economy has grown. This is excellent news, excellent progress against our Paris-aligned targets, but of course we can't be complacent. In December last year, we updated the climate change plan with over 100 new policies and scaled up ambition of over 50 more from the pre-existing 2018 climate change plan. Highlights include a £180 million Emerging Energy Technologies Fund aimed at supporting the development of Scottish hydrogen and carbon capture industries, £120 million for zero-emission buses to accelerate the decarbonisation of Scotland's bus fleet, and a £500 million investment in our natural economy, with peatland restoration and woodland creation helping to enhance biodiversity, to create good green jobs, whilst also tackling climate change. Previous economic transitions, and indeed COVID-19, have already shown us how abrupt and unplanned shifts can exacerbate inequalities. Now more than ever, we need a just transition that supports sustainable economic growth and jobs, whilst ensuring individuals and communities are not left behind. Just transition principles are woven throughout the plan update, with fairness at the heart of our approach. And one area in which we've seen rapid progress is, of course, the renewable energy sector. In 2019, 90% of electricity came from renewable sources. We've embraced and been at the forefront of technology, as exemplified by the Highlands and Islands, having been home to the world's first tidal energy array, the world's most powerful tidal stream device, and the world's largest consented tidal energy site. And at present, we've estimated that 8,000 people in Scotland are employed in renewable energy industries. However, the plan update confirms our intention to maintain the progress we've made in the last decade into the next, and this will ensure much more renewables development, meaning investment and jobs that will drive a just transition. While laying a policy pathway to our highly ambitious targets, the climate change plan update also responded to the economic crisis created by the pandemic by laying out plans for a green recovery to which this government is absolutely committed. A green recovery is an opportunity to take ambitious action that will deliver our transition to net zero across multiple objectives, strengthening our economy and protecting and creating new jobs to deliver well-being, resilience and a fairer society, whilst reducing our emissions and improving our environment. And one key example of how we're already moving to deliver a green recovery is through our £1.6 billion investment to decarbonise heat from buildings. And this investment will create up to 5,000 direct jobs in the next 5 years, while delivering warmer, better homes for people, helping to address fuel poverty and, of course, reducing emissions. And alongside our ambitious domestic work, Scotland is also committed to international cooperation. In November, of course, Glasgow will host COP26. We're very much looking forward to welcoming the world to Glasgow, in whatever way or shape that might be in November, and to delivering a COP26 which sets the world on course for a fair and just transition to net zero by mid-century. As a global leader in climate action, the Scottish Government wants to use COP26 as a platform to champion our conference themes of just transition and people and help to drive forward tangible international climate action. We'll use our role to emphasise the importance of inclusivity and global partnerships in addressing the climate emergency. We'll also use this as an opportunity to showcase Scotland's world-leading approach to climate change, strengthen our international partnerships and commitment to global cooperation in tackling the climate crisis. And we'll use our position as European co-chair for the Under 2 coalition to further all of those aims. So thank you for this opportunity to discuss our work. While the government's work that I've outlined is highly ambitious and entirely necessary, addressing the climate emergency and meeting our very challenging targets must be a truly national endeavour involving action across all facets of society and business. Events like today and the work of Harper Macleod more generally is certainly part of this. So I look forward to further engagement over the next year as we work on implementing the actions from the Climate Change Plan update, revising and developing sector strategies to support delivery and preparing for COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Rosanna Cunningham, the Minister there, for recording that address for us. David, you were listening to that. Some really interesting points come out of that 4-hour conference today.
Yes, Nikki, and for me, the key message really was that Scotland wants to put its own stamp on COP26. I mean, it's a UK conference, but the Cabinet Secretary was emphasising the principles which are important to Scotland. She mentioned the importance of people and communities. She mentioned several times a just transition, and she also mentioned nature-based solutions. Scotland has led the way with its targets, and clearly the government wants to back that up with positive action. So I thought it was a really positive message.
Yeah, lots that we're talking about today that she's picked up on. And I think some of these points, as you say, people and communities, that just transition to net zero where no one is left behind. I guess these are themes that are going to come up throughout our conference today. We're just coming up now to 12:20. So I think it's probably time to crack on. Sadly, the Minister isn't available to join us live, but immediately after this section, we have set 10 minutes or so aside for your comments, your observations and your questions. So please keep them coming in on the chat box and we will catch up with them during that time. It is time now for our first presentation of the day, and I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Greenpeace. Founded 50 years ago, the environmental organisation barely needs an introduction, but their strapline says it all. Together we defend the natural world and stand for a green and peaceful future. Our two speakers work in Greenpeace's legal team. Casey Valenti is legal coordinator of Greenpeace International, and amongst other things, she coordinates their international legal internship programme, which sounds absolutely fascinating. And litigation counsel and member of the New York Bar, Louise Fournier, is our other speaker. She oversees the organisation's climate justice and liability strategies. For the next 20 minutes or so, they're going to treat us to an overview on the societal changes that Greenpeace has already achieved through their work and campaigning, and on the changes that must still come. Casey and Louise will be staying on for that panel discussion after their presentation for your questions, so please send them in as soon as they occur to you, and we will get through as many as we possibly can. Casey, Louise, thank you so much to both of you for joining us from Amsterdam, and I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you so much for that warm introduction. Lou and I are very happy to be here with you today. Good day to all of you listening today. We were happy to hear that in addition to focusing on renewables, this year's Scottish Highland Renewable Energy Conference will also focus on climate change. Greenpeace has an unwavering commitment to sustainability and the protection of biodiversity in all its forms, and to develop solutions for a green, just, and peaceful future. So I agree with Nikki and David. These are some themes that we are going to be hearing throughout the day. We're eager to discuss some of the solutions that we see with you today. So thank you very much, Harper Macleod, for inviting us. We are in an incredibly challenging moment in history, with multiple crises unfolding that pose very tangible threats to human survival. In such times, we must step up our collective responsibility to support those who are most at risk. More often than not, it's the poorest and the least responsible around the world, least responsible for the damage, right? We must also understand that in recovering from crises, we also have the occasion to design and develop solutions that are sustainable and can promote a safer, greener, more peaceful, and just future for all. The time for the development of those solutions and for action is now. Now is the time to transform the world around us, a time to look beyond symptoms and address root causes together. The decisions we make now will shape our world for generations. We can either invest in a resilient recovery from the pandemic that also tackles climate change and builds a more just and equitable society, or we can continue on a path towards climate disaster and economic crisis.
This transformation needs to happen to result in emissions reductions that enable the world to meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we know that this will not happen without a rapid expansion of the renewable energy industry. However, a net zero carbon future must put people at the center of the recovery. For renewable energy companies, that means also respecting human rights of workers and communities. The transformation has to come from shrinking of oppressive power and creating the space to exercise people power. One of my favorite authors and community leaders, Grace Lee Boggs, used to say that people are aware that they cannot continue in the same old way, but are immobilized because they cannot imagine an alternative. We need a vision that recognizes that we are at one of the great turning points in human history. We're so happy to be here with you today to talk about this vision of climate justice and why corporations have a high stake in leading the transition. We want to share with you 3 reasons why businesses should take the lead in combating climate change and how that can lead to societal shifts, drawing from the experiences of the Greenpeace network in climate litigation.
In 2009, we started looking at strategic litigation to assert the fundamental rights of those most impacted by the climate crisis, to address the multiple social, political, and environmental layers of the problem in a cohesive way. Legal strategies would help us address the source of the threats and not only their outcomes. In thinking this through, we identified 3 premises of Greenpeace's climate justice and liability campaign. First, people have rights. Every single one of us has the right to a healthy environment and a safe climate, but also the right to work in dignity. Second, states have duties. Governments have legal obligations to act in a manner that protects people from the impacts of climate change. Governments do not have unlimited discretion. They must take ambitious actions to address the climate emergency and other crises like COVID-19, protect human rights in the process, preserve institutions for the people, and ensure that private actors do not infringe on human rights. Third, businesses have responsibilities. For example, fossil fuel companies and their financial backers have legal responsibilities to prevent, mitigate, and remedy the climate-related impacts that are linked to their products. They have a responsibility to urgently transform their business models and leave no one, especially their workers, behind. Renewable energy companies have responsibilities to ensure that they do not cause human rights harms throughout their operations. If climate change and COVID-19 have taught us anything, it's that all the social and systematic injustices that persist in our societies are exacerbated in times of crisis. What is important is realizing that we have to tackle these crises collectively and at the same time to address inherent inequalities in our system that lead to people experiencing the brunt of climate change or not being able to recover from disasters as quickly. Building an intersectional approach means understanding the climate crisis and other environmental battles in relation to other social struggles against racism, sexism, neoliberalism, and neocolonialism, and away from Eurocentrism.
So having set out the basic principles of our campaign and of our work, I think it's safe to say that everyone in this virtual Zoom room, whether we're policymakers, activists, lawyers, business leaders, or young people, are agreeing that the climate crisis is affecting people's human rights right now. But why should businesses take an active role in combating climate change? And why should businesses actually see climate change as an intersectional human rights issue? Firstly, we say because climate change is a business risk. In 2015, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, delivered a now famous speech to Lloyd's of London, the world's leading insurance bank. He described 3 broad channels through which climate change can actually impact financial stability. The first one is because of impact risk, which are the physical risk due to the impacts of climate change, such as floods or storms that damage property and disrupts trade. And we have seen this recently in Texas with the snowstorms. Secondly, he described the transition risks. These are financial risks that could result from the transition to a lower carbon economy. Finally, he mentioned the liability risks. Corporations and investors are increasingly exposed to liability for their contribution to climate change and for the human rights impacts of their products. 6 years later, in 2021, the mega risks identified by Mr. Carney are well upon us. Which brings me to our second reason why businesses must act on climate change. If they don't, they risk being sued. Over the past decade, climate litigation has really boomed across the world, with now over 600 cases of strategic climate lawsuits brought by individuals and communities. With the research showing that actually 90 corporations are responsible for almost 2/3 of all human-made CO2 emissions, it's no surprise that climate litigation increased in the recent years. Communities are holding these fossil fuel companies accountable for not only failing to disclose the risk of their products, but also for actively denying climate change and misleading the public and policymakers all these years. For instance, dozens of municipalities in the US, including the New York City and San Francisco, have launched lawsuits to hold fossil fuel companies financially responsible to recover the cost of adapting their cities to climate change impacts. Also in the US, the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. and Minnesota filed lawsuits against big fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and Chevron. They're claiming that these companies have spent millions upon millions of dollars to deceive customers about the effects of fossil fuel extraction, production, and consumption, and about the effect that this is having on the climate crisis. They're arguing that these companies are thus violating consumer protection laws of those states. Such cases would only multiply as the evidence is increasingly stronger and the impacts of climate change felt more deeply and widely. Fossil fuel companies are also noticing and disclosing the very real risk of climate liability to their shareholders. But this liability risk is not only for fossil fuel companies. Some litigation is also directed at states for their failure to act on climate. And some of these cases that have been brought against states are actually to increase the mainstreaming of renewable energy capacity. A good example of that is in the case in Mexico. In 2020, Greenpeace Mexico's legal team successfully challenged the COVID-19 contingency policies of the energy sector. The policies were hampering the production of energy from renewable resources, while at the same time they were promoting conventional energy production based on fossil fuels. Greenpeace Mexico convinced the court that the country's fossil fuel-reliant energy sector is impairing the constitutional rights of Mexicans to a healthy environment, to health, and to life. In several regions in Mexico, citizens are experiencing respiratory problems due to the air pollution of the operation of coal-fired power plants, and struggling also to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The court agreed that the policies that limit the operation and participation of renewable energy companies in a national energy market was contrary to the government's international and national obligations, and suspended these policies permanently. Greenpeace Mexico's victory against anti-renewable energy measures shows the liability risk for one sector can become an opportunity for another. In this case, the opportunity to use litigation to uphold human rights to an affordable and accessible clean energy.
And thirdly, because businesses must participate in the social dialogue and lead the transition to be able to not only change our energy system in the face of climate change, but also our economic and political systems. For that, we need to ensure that the affected workers, trade unions, and communities are able to guide policies. In calling for a smooth transition for workers, last year Greenpeace UK worked closely with Friends of the Earth Scotland and Platform, and they published a report titled Offshore, Oil and Gas Workers' Views on Industry Conditions and Energy Transition. In calling, the report builds on a survey of 1,383 offshore workers. This is about 4.5% of the workforce. The survey revealed the impact of COVID-19 on their lives, their views on life in the industry in general, and their hopes and solutions for the energy transition. In addition to the survey results, there were 8 case studies from the workers themselves, revealing an exhaustion with the precarious nature of the work in oil and gas, and a huge appetite for alternative industries, including offshore wind and other renewables. Key results included 81% of the offshore oil and gas workers would consider leaving the industry. 43% had been made redundant or furloughed since March of 2020. 91% of the respondents had not heard of the term just transition. Given the option of retraining to work elsewhere in the energy sector, more than half would be interested in renewables and offshore wind. To reiterate, one of the fundamental premises for Greenpeace's climate justice and liability campaign, I'll repeat, people have rights. Every single one of us has the right to a healthy environment and a safe climate, but that also means the right to work, a free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Given the findings of the survey, Platform, Friends of the Earth Scotland, and Greenpeace UK made recommendations fitting within 3 areas for action, which we urge you to consider during the rest of the conference. The first are skills and experiences of oil and gas workers are essential to deliver an equitable and rapid transition to renewable energy. This requires engaging a representative section of the workforce in policymaking, where workers are able to help determine policy in addition to engagement with trade unions. The rhetoric of a just transition means nothing if impacted workers are not at the heart of shaping policies that affect their livelihoods and communities. It's the only means to ensure no harm to communities currently dependent on high carbon industries. Second, improve job security and working conditions for workers in the oil and gas sector to boost morale, improve quality of life, and mitigate the risk of workers leaving the energy sector altogether. And the third one was to address barriers to entry and conditions within the renewables industry, including creating sufficient job opportunities to harness the skills of the oil and gas workers and enable an equitable and rapid energy transition. We have the opportunity of using green energy to not just get to net zero, but actually moving away from the injustices connected to the fossil fuel industry. From air pollution, land seizures that affect low-income communities and Indigenous peoples the most, and also corruption. For that, we need you, the renewable energy sector in Scotland, to take the lead in putting human rights at the center of your business practice. Enter into continuous conversations with communities and Indigenous peoples, and generally show that a green and just economy is not just about decoupling economic growth from fossil fuels, but a vision of an alternative and better future.
This year, amidst an acute public health crisis and a chronic climate emergency, we have a historic responsibility and an opportunity to accelerate a just transition. We're so glad to see all of you, experts and industry leaders of the Scottish renewable energy sector, embark on this together. Coal, oil and gas companies have been significantly weakened during the pandemic, and people are supporting bold, ambitious and systemic solutions. There's a growing constellation of legal decisions that are helping to make the case that new investments in fossil fuels are unlawful. Shifting power from fossil fuel corporations to renewable energy is essential. But leaving no one behind is not enough. We need to ensure that ordinary people are not just not left behind, but are actually in the front, driving the transition. And that starts at home with the oil and gas workers. In November this year, government leaders will gather in Glasgow for COP26. It is being billed as a landmark test for global climate diplomacy. It will mark 6 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. The deadline is looming for governments to prove their solidarity and deliver concrete, ambitious plans for a pathway to 1.5 degrees. It presents an opportunity for the renewable energy industry to lead the conversation on climate justice, just transition, and intersectionality. There is a vibrant climate justice movement. This movement is toxifying fossil fuels, building community power, increasing people's sense of agency, and contributing to the biggest mindset shift of the century. We invite you to join this movement and be part of a new system that defends and promotes public and planetary health. Thank you so much for having us, and back to you, Nikki.
My goodness, Lou, Casey, thank you so much for that. So much food for thought, and so much actually in what you said that was mirrored by Rosanna Cunningham's speech. You both talked so much about just transition, about responsibilities. Casey, I was really struck by your 3 points. People have rights, states have duties, businesses have responsibilities. There is just so much in that. God, where do we start with this, David? I'm going to hand over to you to ask the first question. Otherwise, I know I'm going to completely dominate the next 20 minutes. And do you want to kick in with something there?
Well, maybe rather than ask a question, maybe just pick up a bit on just transition, Nikki, because it was mentioned it really applies in two different contexts. And one context, which Casey covered, is what we call the energy transition, the transition from fossil fuels into renewables, and making sure that oil and gas workers are not left redundant and we can use those transferable skills. And Scotland obviously has a large oil and gas industry, so it's important that we do that. The Minister didn't elaborate, but the Minister was using just transition, I think, also in the second sense that the impact of COVID has not really been felt equally across society. Marginalised groups have been hit the hardest. And as we move into green recovery, the government would really like to reset our progress towards a net zero economy in a way that tackles that inequality and promotes regional cohesion. If I give some examples of that, when people have had to work from home during COVID, they've obviously had to have their heating on. If you're poor people in society, that's an increased expense. So the government is looking to tackle warmer heating in Scotland. You can't work very well from home if you don't have a good broadband connection. So the government's trying to ensure that broadband is routed out across the country. And for people who can't afford electric cars, then it's important that our public transport fleet is replaced, so that there are, electronic buses, so on, coming on. So I think there was quite a lot of parallels between what Rosanna was saying and what Casey and Louise were talking about. But I'd be interested to get their views also on that. And one other question which occurred to me for Casey and Louise is, what actions do Greenpeace take that have the biggest impact? Where have you seen the greatest success?
Should I start, Casey?
That would be great.
With the first part. Thanks so much, David and Nikki. It was really interesting to hear the cabinet minister's speech and how much it echoed with our presentation right now. And when we're talking about just transition, we need to look at precisely what you're saying, David, the intersectionality of it, and how the struggle for climate crisis is the same struggle for the public health emergency, and is affecting people who are in vulnerable situations more than others. And I think what was really telling was one of the results from the survey. We keep talking about just transition a lot, but 91% of the workers themselves had never heard of this term. So when we're talking about just transition and leaving no one behind, how can we ensure that actually these workers and communities are really shaping the policies? And from that point of view, we think that this is where the just transition and where Scotland could have a worldwide leadership position.
And a huge opportunity there for people who have been made redundant in oil and gas to help upskill the renewables, because one of the things Rosanna Cunningham talked about was the massive opportunity that there will be for the renewables industry going forward. And of course, what the renewable industry will need are staff who know how to actually do the jobs that need to be doing to get that renewable energy out to us. Some questions from our delegates, our audience, if I may jump in with those. I think maybe Karen Bolam, who's an environmental leader, David touched on this earlier and we perhaps didn't get to it. What action that Greenpeace has taken has had the biggest impact? And perhaps we're looking back over your 50 years in history, and that's a big question there. But Casey, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll give it a try. So definitely that's a huge question. What action has Greenpeace taken that's been most successful? So I don't know that I can pin it to just one, but I will say, thinking about the history of Greenpeace, very much the action started with bearing witness. So witnessing things that were happening and bringing them forward to more people and to the public, and to create an awareness of what was happening in our world. I think that there's still a lot of that today. Lou and I, of course, focus on legal work, strategic litigation, and how we can move our Greenpeace campaigns forward through using the law, using different tools. But there are lots of different ways that Greenpeace protects the environment and brings things to the public, or to the consciousness, to create those societal shifts that we need to see, where we maybe are complacent in thinking something is okay. And then we create an awareness and we show, actually, this is really hurting our world and, hurting the planet. So I think Greenpeace has a really storied history of being successful at that.
Of course, I mean, bearing witness and then shining a torch on what is happening. We can't, as a society, whether that's a Highland and Island society, a UK society, a European society, or a global society, we can't do anything about the things that we don't know about. So bearing witness, so incredibly important. Karen Bolan also had a question. How do we ensure collaboration between companies, especially when intellectual property has an influence? And I know I'm talking to three lawyers there. I don't know who wants to jump in and take that one. None of you. That's perhaps one that we'll...
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. How do we ensure collaboration between companies, especially when intellectual property has an influence? That might be one that needs some greater thought, and we can scoop that up in the questions for post-conference.
Yeah, I would just... fully admit I am not a lawyer, so which is funny that I'll be the one to jump in and say this, but I would just say communication would be the starting point of a successful collaboration between different organizations or different companies, and just setting out projects and guidelines and things like that early on.
So I guess the sort of things that Greenpeace have been doing all along, bearing witness, shining a torch on what's happening, and then communicating so that everyone can better understand the entirety of the situation and move forward, I guess, in knowledge of what's going on. We've got a question here from Dermot from Extinction Rebellion in Scotland. And I wonder if this is one that you might want to pick up on, David. What is the government doing to ensure COP26 results in concrete action towards keeping global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees this century above pre-industrial levels? Dermot, obviously we don't have the minister available. She was not available to join us. David, do you feel qualified to answer that on behalf of the government?
Well, I'll give it a go. If we're talking about the Scottish Government, Nikki, I think it's all about demonstrating what we have actually done. The key thing here is that we move at COP26 from words into concrete actions. Scotland was chosen to host, it's a UK conference, but Scotland was chosen as the venue for it because it was seen as the UK country which had developed most in relation to renewable energy and tackle climate change. So it's really important that if the UK and Scotland are saying to the other delegates, this is what we need to do, that they can demonstrate they've done so themselves. So, for instance, Scotland has an excellent track record of closing down our coal power stations. There's been press coverage recently over the proposed new coal power station in England, which wouldn't help the case very much. So it's that type of thing. I think the UK government is coming from quite a long way behind here, certainly a long way behind the Scottish government. It's put out its 10-point plan in its recent energy statement. It needs to back all of these things up, but we've done a great deal in closing down fossil fuel. We've done a tremendous amount in renewable energy in Scotland in relation to onshore wind and hydro, in England in relation to offshore wind, where we're now a world leader. So it's important that these things are backed up. And we say to people, this is the path we've got to go. And hopefully with the recent change of presidency in America, that will give it a boost. And, Joe Biden and John Kerry will really want to push on and show how America can get back on track. So it's really about everyone, walking the walk, talking the talk, putting what they say into action and taking things forward.
Casey, I can see you nodding there. Anything that you'd like to add?
No, I just agree about walk the talk, right? It's time. I just feel like it's time for action. And so I was, yes, definitely nodding along as David was mentioning that. I really, like Lou and I mentioned, just no more talk. Time to show us, right? So that's well.
I was very conscious when you were talking that you used the phrase "the time is now," which was the refrain in the song that we opened this conference for. There isn't time to spend time, although of course that is what we were doing today, spending time talking and chatting and discussing. But if Greenpeace hadn't done that, started doing that 50 years ago, shining the light, asking for action, saying this is what is happening, we need to change. It's perhaps a shame that we weren't able to hear what you were saying 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and acting on more of that at the time. Perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today if we had paid a little bit more attention. Time is marching on. Thank you so much to our Greenpeace guests, Casey Valenti and Lou Fournier. Really, really great to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us from Amsterdam. We appreciate you giving up your time and sharing your insights and your vision. Thank you so much. David, you are up next, I believe. Chairing a fireside chat on the key asks for developers and investors. Topics on the table for your next session include What are the hurdles from a developer's point of view? How can communities become involved? And what is the investment perspective? Now, I understand you have 3 guests waiting in the wings, so I'll hand you over to introduce your panellists. And I'll keep an eye on the questions and answers as they're coming in and catch up with you in about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. I think if we'd been holding this a week ago, it would have been a fireside chat, but fortunately the weather conditions are a lot better today. But nevertheless, I'm delighted to welcome my 3 guests who will hopefully now join us on screen. First of all, George Baxter, who is the Director of Development at Green Power International. Secondly, Finlay Bex-Phelps, who is the UK Development Director at Fred Olsen Renewables. And thirdly, Michael Covington, who is an Investment Director in the Renewables team at Alpha Real Capital. And over the next 40 minutes, we'll be discussing what the key asks are from developers and investors to allow them to build and finance the projects that will be required to contribute towards our decarbonisation targets. Sorry, I can't see the gentleman on screen. Has everyone now joined us?
Yep.
Hi, George. Welcome.
Hi there. Hi.
Hi, David. It's Michael here.
Michael, you with us? And Finlay, you with us?
I'm here as well.
Great stuff. Okay. So, as before, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat section and we'll try to pick up as many as we can towards the end of the session. So just to start us off, guys, could you quickly tell us about the projects your companies have developed or financed in Scotland and what you're hoping to do over the next 5 years or so if the conditions are right? George, we start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David, and hello to everybody. Green Power International is a Scottish-based renewable energy company. We've developed over 250 megawatts of renewable energy schemes, celebrating our 21st birthday this year. And we've been involved in onshore wind primarily, but also in hydro and in solar, and developing quite a strong solar project pipeline. I personally have worked in the Highlands for many years. Formerly served, sounds like a bit of a sentence, 12 years at SSE, developing a lot of its portfolio in the Highlands. And we have a number of new sites in the Highlands, and Islands in particular, in Green Power. I think we have a strong ambition for growth. We know that we absolutely have to deliver by 2030. I think based on the conversations that I've heard so far, I think 2030 really has to be our main focus. And I think actually that should be Scotland's big focus in terms of the COP26. What are we doing now to deliver by 2030? 2045, 2050, they don't actually really matter. In the political cycle, it's 2030 that will make the difference, and we need the actions now. And it's in that area that I think a lot of our conversations need to take place, because sure, the time for talking is up. The time for real action is now, but talk of 2045 and 2050 just allows too much wriggle room for politicians in particular to bat off tough decisions into other elected officials' political cycles and not theirs.
Okay, that's a useful introduction, and some points we'll perhaps come back to, George, and thanks for bringing your wind turbine to the table as well. Finn, can I turn to you and tell us a bit about what Fred Olsen have been doing and what you're looking to do?
Yeah, absolutely, David, and thank you very much for the invite this afternoon. I've always really enjoyed attending the SHREC conference, so to be able to talk at it is great. We've actually been at the renewables game for quite a long time now, I think 2.5 decades. We actually had the first consented project in Scotland in 1993. That came into operation in 1996. Since then, we've developed a further 5 core complexes that consist of 10 operational wind farms, totaling more than 500 megawatts of onshore wind. We've also invested more than £5.7 million in community benefits. Specifically in the northern regions, we have 3 operational sites, Paul's Hill and Rothes 1 and 2, totaling more than 150 megawatts. Between those developments themselves, we've almost invested further £2 million into community benefits into that area, just by itself. They've now been operating since 2005. We as an organisation are looking at making the renewables at the core of our future business, and that is evident of now having a further consented project at 25 megawatts. We've got a further 100 megawatts currently in planning, and a further 170 megawatts in early stage projects. To date, we've been very successful. We've had 100% success rate, and that is largely down to working hand in hand with the community, and it is that at the core of what we will have moving forward. And certainly we are looking very much forward to continuing our presence in the Highlands region.
Okay, that's very useful, Finn, and clearly a lot of activity up north, and we'll come back to that. And finally, Michael, can you tell us a bit about Alpha and the type of renewable projects you're interested in investing in?
Yeah, thanks, David. Hello, everyone. It's like Finley, it's a real honour to be here. I attended in person 2 years ago, and it's no exaggeration to say that the relationships that started and were developed since have led to real progress for our organisation, so it's wonderful. So Alpha Real Capital is a specialist real assets fund manager. We have just over £4 billion of our clients' money. Think of us as real assets, real long-term income, protected against inflation. Renewables has been a big success for us. We've come from a very low level to over £650 million in over 100 sites across wind, solar and hydro. We have hydros in Scotland, for example. We're capable of powering 100,000 homes with clean energy. Team of 14 people doing this full time. 3 are physically based in Edinburgh, using a panel of very talented local professional advisors, including David and his team at Harper Macleod. So, what are we thinking about? We're thinking that for the future, I should say over 20% of our investments are in Scotland by value. So we have a real passion for the market, and we just want to keep going. Over half of onshore wind capacity is in Scotland, but the subsidies, RO and feed-in tariff, mainly renewables obligation, are sliding away. Not only were the earlier turbines mainly quite small and inefficient by today's monsters, efficient monsters, we're seeing that by 2030, over half of what we see around us now will have lost its subsidy. So this is tremendous opportunity for owners and developers to repower. We're investing now in our first so-called subsidy-free projects, so no subsidy at all. And nearly all of these for us are in Scotland. We're taking a very keen interest, in the forthcoming onshore contracts for difference auctions. We're actively recruiting partners, and the Highlands and Islands in particular will definitely punch way above their weight, due to excellent wind conditions and local support and expertise. It was great to hear the Cabinet Secretary confirming earlier the Scottish Government's policies and desire to see tremendous development of the sector in Scotland. But, the ask is, what are investors such as Alpha looking for? So what are these asks? The key cornerstone is a strong legal framework. People always hear investors complaining about rule changes. It's fundamental to how we look after our investors, how we lower the cost of our funds. But generally speaking, long-term predictable revenues, ideally with inflation proofing, attract many more investors and deliver substantially lower costs of investment and higher valuations for everyone in the supply chain to enjoy. So this is the key trade-off, David, for the government. in weighing up the cost benefit of support mechanisms.
Okay, that's very useful. I think that's a really good introduction of where you're all coming from. So can I maybe turn first to you now, Finn? So what are the key challenges developers face in bringing these projects to fruition, and why is overcoming them so crucial to meeting our targets?
Yeah, I can't make any secret that we do operate within a hugely challenging environment. We're quite fortunate having now operated for a number of decades. We've seen what works and wasn't, and what doesn't work. I think if you begin to look at projects individually, then themselves, they're fairly robust in their nature. They can take a fair degree of uncertainty. But it's when you begin to introduce new levels of risk that begins to be put into question. And when I talk about risks, I mean that historically we had the renewables obligation. We then had that changed over about the CFD. And we're now looking at merchant power price. How do we begin to look at the forecasting prices? There's huge variation amongst future projections. You begin to introduce the likes of cannibalization, and it gets even harder to forecast. We've got projected increases of use of system charges when it begins to look at transmission network, let alone begin to think about some of the costs that we have to incur to overcome some of the radar issues that we have. When you begin to introduce these levels of complexity, then it does make these developments particularly challenging to bring forward. So while I don't necessarily want to take away George from his discussion on MPF4, it's great that we've got an ambition from the Scottish Government to bring forward these future aspirations. But what we really need to see is a very clear commitment. What are the targets? And we need to be looking at 20 gigawatts of onshore wind. And again, to reiterate George's point, we need to be looking at what 2030 looks like and not 2045 or 50. We need to look at how that planning policy is fed down from national planning and how local authorities are supported to bring forward these ambitions. It is a challenging environment, but there are also a lot of positives to take away from it. We've got this new CFD pot coming forward later this year that will help bring a lot of certainty to developers. We also need to look at all the raft of new policies that came forward at the end of last year. It's a really encouraging place, and I think today we've had a huge amount of already very positive messages, and I think the future does look encouraging in that regard. And also, we cannot forget that the huge investment that the new renewables industry has brought forward to the Scottish economy with little or no government investment moving forward. And that in turn has also supported a significant amount of jobs. When we begin to look at our individual projects, we also have direct and indirect benefits I think we need to consider. The direct benefits, I believe, are fairly evident. We're bringing forward more clean generation, we're helping meet some of the carbon reduction targets, we're introducing better connectivity in more rural areas, and bringing more investment into these areas where there were none beforehand. That in turn brings more skilled jobs. But that's all great, but what are the indirect benefits that I mentioned? Well, I think we need to consider about how we as developers act in these areas. By working hand in hand with our rural communities and local areas, we can bring a whole range of different benefits that aren't directly associated to our developments, but by us being in those areas. That could mean more increase of rural heating, better transport, better broadband rollout, help support electric vehicle uptake, but ultimately helping support rural economy. That in turn helps support a green recovery that's going to be more important now than ever, particularly in the post-COVID world. I think when we try and capture all of that and why that's so important, I think the Scottish Government all in all have been very supportive of us as an industry, but we also owe it as ourselves to make sure that we are acting responsibly and demonstrating the reason and need for that support. That in turn also helps encourage the UK government agenda in terms of putting forward robust targets, particularly as we move towards COP26. So yes, there are challenges, but it is a very exciting place that we're moving towards.
Okay, thanks, Finn. We'll maybe come back to some of those points about communities later if we've got time. George, when I started in renewables 30 years ago, the main issue for developers was planning. And 30 years on, it still seems to me that the main issue for developers is planning. So Finn has mentioned the National Planning Framework 4. Could you elaborate a bit about that and just tell us how, in your view, the planning system has to be adapted to fit in with our climate change targets?
Yeah, sure. It is really important. It's taking too long. The climate emergency was declared in 2019, and the National Planning Framework reforms aren't set to come in until 2022. So that's an issue to start with. But it's a really important process, because it's not just a national planning framework, as previous ones have been, setting out a kind of spatial strategy for the country. Also, this time, for the first time after the Climate Act in 2019, contains all of Scottish planning policies, which will determine how decisions are reached. And the Minister has said that he intends to have climate change as a guiding principle for the planning system. I think it needs to become an imperative, and we need to treat the climate emergency as a real and present emergency. And so, to my previous point, that we need action, we need urgent action to what's really needed. And what's really needed actually is a planning system that can enable the deployment, and particularly in onshore wind, the most modern, efficient standard turbines where it is windy. That's what we need in a subsidy-free environment, where we need to have the most competitive and the most efficient wind farms. So that's its first task. The planning system doesn't take account of that, and that's where we need a lot more weight added to the decision making. When a decision is being made on a project, the balance is decided on sort of benefits and impacts, and we need much more weight in the planning balance onto the climate emergency. And there's a lot of people in industry calling for urgent action now. We don't need to wait until 2022 before putting more weight onto the decisions that are made to enable projects to get through and to shift that planning balance. So that's one thing that I think that we need to see happen, and we need to see happen soon. There's an election in the way, obviously at the moment, but these run-of-the-mill everyday things like elections shouldn't be getting in the way of the actions that we need to deliver on climate change. And solar as well. Solar energy wasn't even mentioned in the National Planning Framework position statement that was set out recently, and Scotland doesn't really get its fair share of solar when you look at on a UK-wide basis, and so we can do a lot more there, and so that onshore wind and solar can do a lot of the early heavy lifting in the green recovery. What would be good is to set some clear targets for volumes that we need by 2030. And if we have that confidence that, say, we're going to double the amount of onshore wind in Scotland by 2030, that means building 1,000 megawatts every year between now and then. In 2020, we only built around 30 megawatts. So there's a big job to be done there, and the planning system really holds the key to it all.
Yep, I'm sure a lot of people would agree with a lot of your points there, George. At SHREC, we've always focused a lot on the Highlands. Have you any specific points on the north of Scotland? I mean, how can the vast natural resources in that area be harnessed?
Well, don't get me started on wild land, but I suppose I have to mention it. Many areas in the Highlands are actually, they're declared as wild land areas, but they're barren shadows of their former selves. They're ecologically poor. They're not the living landscapes they once were, with people living in them alongside richer wildlife. And renewables can be part of creating that living landscape picture too, bringing employment and resilience to communities. And so I think we need to change the thinking here. there's often talk of the right projects in the right places. I think actually we need to discard that as a concept and start talking about as many projects in as many places as we need to hit our targets. So that rhetoric, I think, has had its day. It's become kind of meaningless. And of course, projects shouldn't be built where actual harm to endangered species or iconic settings in the Highlands that are, a lot of them are already fully protected through being national scenic areas, for example. But often landscape effects are used to attack perfectly good projects from a landscape-only perspective. Someone will always say a project is in the wrong place. And you just have to look at the trouble. Scotland, I would regard as Scotland's best located wind farm at Strathclyde, had just along the Great Glen, which was supported by local councillors and the local community, yet opposed by landscape groups. I think I would make one final comment about the responsibility of this generation. Some behave as if a wind turbine in the landscape is bad. I mean, I would disagree with that. I think they look great. But whether you love them, quite like them, don't mind them, or just plain and simple don't like them, which in most polls is around 10% of the population don't actually like them, I think they're a symbol that this generation is prepared to accept change in the landscape over a relatively short period, whether it's 25, 30 or 50 years, to tackle the climate threat, which will have impacts for many, many generations to come. So I think we need to start thinking long-term and acting fast, and that's the dynamic that the planning system in particular needs to enable for the Highlands.
Okay, thanks. Michael, turn to you. So what sort of improvements are investors looking for to ensure the necessary money comes into Scotland to enable these projects to be built?
Yeah, thanks, David. The money is clearly lined up. There are new funds being launched on a weekly basis. So, socially responsible investing really is becoming a reality. Just before I plunge in, though, George's point about, my spin on it is a wind turbine is there for 40 years. We're not blasting the Grampian Mountains to mine or do landfill sites. There's a turbine there for 40 years to prevent runaway global warming. We'll talk later, I think, as time permits, about how communities could buy into that, and not just as a moral, as a responsibility to future generations, but also what's good for the finances and economic health of communities. For me, though, without doubt, the key thing is grid in the Highlands and Islands. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the north of Scotland is powered by wind and water, and what a blessing that is. But as SSE Networks has said recently, about 2/3 of that power is exported southwards, to the Central Belt and also into the north of England, and it's a truly national grid, of course. National grid, it was conceived in the 50s and 60s for the whole nation. It's been a tremendous asset and really looked after us, as has the offshore oil and gas resources. And, they were built ahead of need. You don't go, everyone needs electricity, but there's no network. Somebody has to put in place that critical infrastructure. I was joking with you, David, that I'm sure once upon a time the A9 road was relatively empty, but you felt maybe it was never that empty. But just like the Kevin Costner movie Field of Dreams, I think with the grid, not just transmission, but distribution, if you build it, they will come. Just a statistic, 7.4 gigawatts of onshore wind approximately in Scotland. Finn was saying 20 gigawatts by 2030 onshore. Put that into context, the Bewley-Denny transmission line, an amazing but controversial project, 220 kilometres through the Cairngorms, not least, 400 kilovolts. That is 1.2 gigawatts of capacity. That is 800 Glasgow as a city is 800 megawatts at peak, but 1.2 gigawatts compared to at least 10 gigawatts in the next 9 years. We really got to think about building the field of dreams. And just to touch on the Viking energy wind farm, people, I think, regulators, I think in the government, in the Scottish Crown Estate, everybody is trying to do their bit to help the Shetlands deliver this monumental 550 megawatt project. The new turbine heights that were agreed, and George touched on modern efficient machinery. These things are 155 meters from base to tip, let alone the mountains they're on, the plains. They're 18 meters taller than the Old Man of Hoy. So the Orkneys won't be very happy about the competition. So, exciting things, but there's just so much to do on the national transmission grids. And just a final point from me, David, on grids, talking to wind farm developers, they're overjoyed if they have connection offers to put new capacity on within a couple of years. Some people have been notified it's going to be 2030. And then you have all these curtailments and the dreaded active network management to contend with. And I'll say as an investor, somebody says, here's my new wind farm, Alpha. We go, this is great. How can we help? And then they say, well, actually, the grid's really challenging. We can't guarantee it will be allowed to export all the time. We can't even say that the next door neighbouring wind farm might trip out the whole circuit. And whatever the quality of our development approach, we could be yanked offline. So lots of issues there.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Michael. And I'm just watching. There's quite a few questions coming into the chat based on your comments so far, all of you. So we'll try and get to those. But Finn mentioned earlier the next CFD allocation round. I mean, do any of these grid issues which you've mentioned impact on that, Michael?
Yeah, there's lots of very clever economists that work for the ministries, and they're working for developers such as Fred Olsen, I'm sure. We subscribe to some very high quality services to help guide the way, particularly in subsidy free, and the CFD, David. don't pin me on this, but levelized cost of energy, which is effectively what the price of the power has to be to give the turbine manufacturers the capex, to give the installers the running around money, the labour money, and to pay everyone and to give investors a target rate of return. That's £40 per megawatt hour with very efficient new machines. It's heading south. So that's great. That's cheaper than we're used to seeing for pool price power. However, who pays for the transmission network? It really is one of the most fun things I had to learn was jargon. And to NUOS, transmission network use of system, it's clearly upset SSE networks, because only a couple of days ago, they put out a very interesting, well-researched report saying, did you know that a wind farm in the north of Scotland pays on top of every other cost £5.50 per megawatt hour of energy. But, and I don't want to start any conflicts here, an equivalent wind farm in Wales that they identified actually gets remunerated, gets paid to be a distributed generator helping out. They get paid £2.80. So the delta between the two, doing a bit of mental maths, £8.30, that's 20% difference. Talk about running to stand still. Where's that level playing field? And to finish, this theme of hidden costs, maybe, the CFD consultation it's still suggesting that if the day ahead power price in that zone is negative for any short period, 15 minutes or half hour, then the whole day is off. all bets are off, no subsidy for that day. And you might think, oh, that's okay, what we do is a drop in the ocean. But it's not. It's a local consideration, power prices. The UK, Scotland is zonal. And you simply can't deliver tens of gigawatts of offshore and another 10 gigawatts of onshore capacity with the wind resource pretty uniform across the British Isles, pretty uniform. Everyone's going to be scrambling to get customers for their power at the same time. And as strange as it seems, that leads to negative power prices. So if you have a mechanism where only for 15 minutes of a day there's a negative power price, you lose your subsidy, I don't know what investors are going to make of it, because the more you build, the worse that's going to get.
Okay, that's very useful. There's a couple of other topics I'd like to touch on before we finish. One is in relation to supply chain, and the other is in relation to involvement of communities. Finn, one of the issues the Scottish Government has been pushing is more local content in developments, especially in the supply chain, because obviously they need to be able to demonstrate to the people of Scotland that more Scottish jobs have been created in exchange for the planning consents which they'll issue. What are your views on that and how achievable it is?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I've got fairly sort of strong views on that, and I think I've highlighted a couple of times today already the need to work very closely with your local areas. And when I talk about local areas, I don't just necessarily mean communities. I will talk about supply chain. Going back to George's point about the 2030 targets, we have proposing huge, big ambitions, and of course concentrate initially on onshore wind. We as developers, or maybe a smaller group of individuals, but to bring some of these developments forward needs a huge amount of expertise. They're the people that are really driving the project. You begin to think about construction and what is needed for that, not just in terms of expertise, but even to begin to think about materials and machinery and cranes to build these things. If you begin to think about operation, we as an organisation have over 250 operational units. It takes over a day to maintain just one of those, and they have to be maintained every single year. Multiply that across the entire country, we're desperately short of real skilled expertise. So it's not really a matter of whether we should be, thinking about our supply chain. We have to think about our supply chain to start bringing forward these expertises to help meet the future ambitions. Introduce offshore into that argument. We're going to have a huge port issue. How do we begin to retrofit some of these ports to help the fabrication of offshore turbines? How do we use these ports to begin to facilitate the operation of that development? There is a real shortage of expertise to bring forward the future ambitions. And so we are at a prime opportunity now, particularly in the next 5-10 years, to all work together, to work within our local areas, to make sure that we are bringing forward the expertise across a broad spectrum of supply chain. So, from my perspective, I'm very supportive of it.
Yeah, and that ties into what we were talking about in the earlier session, the just transition and how oil and gas workers could help. I mean, George, do you have similar views as developers?
Yeah, I think, to my mind, if we had imagined 20 years ago that we would have 8 gigawatts of onshore wind in Scotland, which I think someone saying that around the turn of the century would have been, laughed at. We have it. If we had known then that we would have 8 gigawatts, we would have a much bigger supply chain now. So the opportunity we have now is to have a much more, a stronger approach to a more confident pipeline so that the supply chain can invest. And again, I hate to say it, it goes back to the planning system and policy to give this not just developers, but the supply chain the confidence to invest in the short term for long-term gain. And also you have to bear in mind that various studies that have been conducted over on onshore projects show that the actual level of domestic spend for an onshore wind farm over its lifetime is still pretty good. It's at above 60%, 65% of the overall money spent on a wind farm is retained domestically within the UK. So that's very positive. I think there's a bit of focus on where the turbines come from, but when you look at the whole picture, it's not as bad as is painted. But Finn's right. We need to invest in people, and we need to invest in the supply chain so that Scotland and the UK can reap the rewards of the transformation.
Okay, thanks for that.
Gentlemen, I hate to butt in. David, I don't know if you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me. What an immensely fascinating discussion. Goodness, you would not believe how the question boards have been lighting up with your questions. I'm conscious that we promised everyone lunch at 1:30, so I hope I'm not jumping in too soon. I wonder if we can cover off some of these questions. Am I okay just to go ahead on these?
Yeah, on you go, Nikki.
Okay, first couple, I'm going to put these two together. They're both about onshore and offshore wind. Rob Gibson is asking, is there a trend of developers to move action to more profitable offshore wind and leave consented onshore sites fallow? And Gavin Kingsmith is asking, do the developers accept that Scotland's onshore wind farms, built and envisaged, will have negligible effect globally on the climate, but will have a long-term damaging effect on the Scottish land? George, I think this is one for you. And that Scotland should be in the forefront of offering refuge for those in other parts of the world affected by past energy exploitation by humans. I don't know who wants to dive in with that one first.
Well, I'll deal with the question that I tend to think of as the China syndrome, where folks say, "Oh, it doesn't matter what we do here; it doesn't really make any difference." We need to take responsibility for what we can do. We're actually a relatively small part of the global population, so but that's no excuse for not doing anything. We need to bear the responsibility that we have. There's also a responsibility to harness the amazing renewable resource that we have in this country, which is the envy of many other countries, and assist others in our region to decarbonise as well through the export of power and technology. So I think that the question about, there's no point in us doing anything, it doesn't make any difference, essentially is what's been said. Frankly, I think that's a bit misconstrued and misleading.
Yeah, I would say, goodness me, jobs are created by cheap energy, jobs and prosperity, cheap, clean energy. And there is a once in a generation opportunity to take this so far beyond. It will have tremendous benefits everywhere. So I think saying, what about the landscape? Yes, okay, these are beautiful landscapes. Scotland enjoys vast vistas, but these machines are needed now, and it's not landfill, we're not blasting mountains. The other one I'd just comment on quickly, offshore wind is a very specialised investment topic, very, very large, monumentally large schemes. And most investors by value can't play, they won't play, it's too much. But investors are lining up to fund high quality, highly efficient onshore projects. And there's going to be oodles of capital for well-developed, well-planned schemes. So it's, put the grid in, get the communities on side. It's there to be done.
Okay. Another question then, and this one is directly to Finlay. Over to you then, Finn, from Tor Justad. Does Finlay envisage developers getting directly involved in local projects, such as improved broadband or public transport? Or are you, thinking of community funds which developers currently contribute to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a bit of a combination of both of them, being honest. I think we as developers can facilitate a lot through our individual developments. Certainly we could begin to support potential opportunities that even exist on the site alone. That might even be introduction of, say, for example, mountain bike trails, or helping better access to more rural areas. You can actually use the infrastructure on site to help the rollout of broadband. On top of that, you can also look at introducing apprenticeship schemes and have contracts within the actual consent that will help facilitate the rollout of those opportunities. And there's some really encouraging signs of communities around Scotland working together to take some of the volume of community benefit that's coming forward and really beginning to protect and secure these rural communities that are using the community benefit at the core of that aspiration. So, yeah, I mean, it really is both strands, and we as a developer certainly look to try and do as much as possible as part of these planning applications.
Okay, lovely, fairly comprehensive answer there, and I hope it answers Tor's question. And just a final one, because I've got one eye on the clock. This is from Lloyd Edwards, and I appreciate that this is a big question as well, but I'll ask for a really brief answer from each of you, starting with you, Mike. In the context of hundreds of billions that are earmarked for mega projects such as HS2, motorway expansions and nuclear, especially when compared to falling costs of sustainable energy, where would the panel prefer to see this money spent? And bearing in mind, I'm giving you, literally 15 seconds each. Over to you, Mike, first.
Nikki, monumentally large pumped storage to allow us to have strategic storage of the electricity from offshore and onshore Highlands and Islands.
So pumped storage from Mike. George?
Well, I think we need to be putting money into all sorts of things across decarbonising the economy through renewables, and anything which takes away demand from renewables, particularly if it's either unproven or inherently unsustainable, should be avoided. Okay,
and Finn.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo George's comment. We as an industry don't necessarily need the support. We've had 20 years of that, but it's not just renewable energy, it is across the entire sector in terms of decarbonisation, heating, transport, and even on pump storage. So it's a combined effort to really support everything to meet the decarbonisation targets.
And David, I didn't warn you about this, but I'm going to give you a chance to come in with your 10 seconds worth on that one as well. Where would you spend the money?
Well, I used up the 10 seconds already thinking about it, but no, I wouldn't spend it on HS2 type projects. But I think, and I was listening to Bill Gates' webcam the other night, and he was making the point that we either have to deal with the storage issue or we need more nuclear. I appreciate he wasn't talking solely about Scotland. So I think, as Michael said, I think we have to solve the storage issue, and that moves into carbon capture and storage as well. But there's lots of places, as long as it's spent correctly.
As long as it's spent correctly. There we go. That's the catch-all answer.
Just put me in charge, Nicky, and we'll be okay.
Why didn't we all think of that? That is it. We are eating into people's sandwich time, or they're going outside for a quick walk with the dog time, or their networking time. So I will thank you all, gentlemen, for an incredibly interesting discussion. And I see that the questions are still coming in. So we will try and capture as many of those as we possibly can. And we will store them in a document with the answers if we possibly can. And we'll get that out. Thank you to you all very, very much. We are going to take a quick break for lunch now, half an hour for you to use as you wish. So either get outside, get away from the screen. It's a lovely day here in Inverness. I hope it's nice where you are as well. And come back here at 2 p.m. sharp. We'll be talking about decarbonisation and the use of Scotland's natural resources with Nature Scot and Forestry Land Scotland. If you are taking a break from the screen, just walk away from your laptop, leaving the webinar open, and we will still be here when you get back, I promise. The other option, for those of you who are craving adult conversation with people who are not in your immediate family or delivering groceries to your house, come and join us in the meeting rooms. It's still a Zoom platform, but you will have to leave the webinar and then come out and log in to a meeting room, and you will have been sent all the details of how to do that. The networking in meeting rooms have been randomly set up, so you don't know who you're going to be in with next. Any conversation, any chat that comes up while you're having your sandwiches, that you think it would be useful for us all to know, then do put that into the Q&A boxes just as an observation, and we will pick up as many as we can. So thank you so much for joining us so far this afternoon. Enjoy your lunch, enjoy your networking, enjoy your walk with the dog, and we will see you back here at That's 2 o'clock, and we are back live at SHREC 21. I hope you all managed to get a little bit of a break, a little bit of a sandwich. I had a very nice banana, thank you very much. And we are back with another hour and a half of really good content and some networking to take us up to 4 o'clock. So stay with us if you can. Just catching up on some of the messages that you've been sending. It's really great to get your interaction. Judith Patton got in touch saying it's interesting that the Climate Change Committee is now talking of decisive transition. Decisiveness is certainly what we want and need. And I think actually that has been echoed right throughout all of the discussions that we've had so far today, certainly from Greenpeace as well. And Tor just had got in touch to pose a question to Finlay earlier on during that panel session just before lunch. I said I hoped that Finlay's fairly comprehensive answer did answer all of his points, and he's come back and said, thanks Finlay, very helpful answer, and presumably direct involvement by developers would mean that developers, in addition to keeping renewable energy projects running, would then have staff who had continuing roles working within local communities. This, I think, could work well, as small isolated communities often suffer from burnout by local volunteers and need good technical advice on FE broadband. Really good point there, Tor. Thank you so much. Communities are so much more than just the resources they have. They are very much about the people who live there. And I think the minute we forget that, then we're on a short straw to, oh goodness, hiding to nothing. A few of you have been asking, obviously really enjoying what we're achieving today, and asking whether the conversations and everything will be available to watch again. The good news is that yes, we are recording everything that is going out during the course of this afternoon. So all the presentations, the conversations, the panel discussions will be available for you to watch again and to share with your own networks. Check out the Harper Macleod website. They've got a climate change tab across the top of their website there, and they will put everything, all the resources from today will be there, and of course they'll also be chunked up and put out on social media again. So use them, share them amongst your staff, whoever you think would be interested in seeing what we have been discussing today. So on with the conference. Last week I caught up with the panellists in this next session, and we recorded our chat from home. Now, we'd planned to talk about decarbonisation and Scotland's natural resources, but as these things often go, we started with those topics, but we used them as a launch pad, and we ended up talking about all sorts of other things as well. We only had 25 minutes. We know we could definitely have gone on much longer. Now, true to form, this being this year, Zoom glitched a little bit. It wasn't, yes, it's what we've all got used to. So if you'll forgive us the odd little hiccup along the way, please. The panellists were Robbie Kernigan from Nature Scot, Joe Ellis from Forestry and Land Scotland, and Graham Nisbet from Harper Macleod's rural team. And when we come out of this session, it's a 25-minute recording, we're going straight into another session, but I'm delighted to say that Robbie and Graham will be joining us for a Q&A at 2:55. So any questions or comments that you may have for them will be scooped up then. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to myself in my dining room. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, for this session on screen, I have Graham Nisbet, who is the lead partner of Harper Macleod's 15-strong rural team. Thanks for joining us, Graham. Also, we've got Robbie Kernigan, who leads Nature Scot's work to deliver sustainable growth. Nice to see you, Robbie. And Joe Ellis, who is Head of Planning and Environment at Forestry and Land Scotland. Really nice to see you too, Joe. Now, we have literally just 25 minutes to romp through an amazing and huge and fascinating subject. So I really hope that we can do it justice in the time that we have. We're going to be talking about decarbonisation and sustainable use of natural resources. And that's something that you three all know an awful lot more about than I do. So let's just dive right in. What are the main issues here, and what can and should be done about it? That is a really big question, but I'm going to give you about a minute. Robbie, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Nikki. Where will I start? So I think climate change and biodiversity loss, those two things are inextricably linked. You know, globally, nationally and locally, enormous effort is needed to tackle them both. So when thinking about the climate emergency and the green recovery, I think the facts of the matter are that as we make progress in energy and transport and housing sectors, as we have been for some time, the importance of land use comes into much greater focus. So the challenge in shifting the rural economy away from its dependence on fossil fuels and traditional use of the land and sea towards a nature-rich net zero economy are significant. And it won't be easy. I think my overall sense is that the amount of change required to make that transition is not really appreciated by many. There's a real hearts and minds job to do. But it also requires systematic changes to policy and practice, and probably greater urgency and focus if Scotland's going to meet its interim net zero targets. And I think that importance has been reiterated very recently. The Dasgupta report published by the UK Treasury, an independent review of biodiversity and the economics of it, which says that nature is our most precious asset and we're all asset managers. But it also states that we're seriously mismanaging those assets with demands which exceed capacity. So that needs to change.
Goodness, that's a really strong statement there. Nature is our most precious asset, but we're mismanaging it. Joe, Forestry and Land Scotland, is that where you're seeing the things as well, or anything that you can add from your perspective?
I would completely agree with what Robbie said there. From Forestry and Land Scotland perspective, we manage 8% of Scotland. It's a really big land holding we manage on behalf of Scottish ministers and people of Scotland. And where I see us being able to make a difference along the lines that Robbie suggests is to do things that help with the climate emergency, but also help with nature. So two of the big things that we're doing on climate, one is planting trees. So we create more woodlands, expand the woodlands in Scotland. But if we can do that in a way which supports nature, connects habitats, expands habitats with the right species, we can support nature too. The other one that we're doing at the moment that's really focused on climate change is peatland restoration. Again, that's a massive win for not just the birds and animals that use peat bogs, but also clean water, for loads of natural capital outcomes. So I think for me, trying to see these two things, climate and nature crisis, as very much interlinked, is where we'll make the biggest wins.
So interlinking then climate and nature, we really need to make big strides. Graham, you are the head of the rural team at Harper Macleod, and you work alongside Robbie's organisation in particular. They're both public sector. You also represent lots of private clients, big landowners, farmers, who may have some resistance, shall we say, to the handing over or handing back of large swathes of land to nature in order to aid the green recovery. How are your clients or some of your other clients seeing this? What is the resistance? What needs to be done? What can be done? Gosh, that's a long question.
Well, listen, I think that there is a degree of resistance, but perhaps not as much as I think some sectors fear. I mean, there's very much a huge drive from the public sector, as Robbie and Joe have just touched on, in terms of pushing this emergency agenda forward. But actually, the scale of it is such that the private sector needs to be involved, both as direct participants and in funders. Otherwise, we're simply not going to meet our net zero targets. Now, we do have landowners who are very much vested in protecting and enhancing nature, whether that's conservation bodies, even traditional landowners or community bodies. But you're right. I think there's a bit of a carrot and a stick needed here. And we are, we now have companies and organisations who have to publish emissions and greenhouse gas data. And this information is freely available to investors, to journalists, and indeed to activists. And we're also seeing a range of emission trading schemes which work by setting emission caps certain types of installations, such as oil refineries, offshore platforms, or indeed aircraft operators, where permitted emissions are reduced over time but can be offset by acquiring carbon credits. And we have a range of carbon credit offset arrangements throughout the UK, including the UK Carbon Land Registry, peatland credits under the Peatland Code, and woodland carbon credits under the Woodland Carbon Code, which all create, to my mind, significant opportunities for land use investment and indeed value. And that's something that I think the private sector is very much invested in, and indeed is where there's a huge opportunity for them. And that's just not just landowners, because actually we're also seeing investors and funders that are really interested in this area and in the whole decarbonisation market piece, and are very much gearing up to play their part, and no doubt to get their share of the spoils. So I think that there are different drivers for the private sector, and some are perhaps a little bit more negative than others. But I think there's a real confluence of them coming together at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, money is absolutely going to be a driver, because let's face it, most people, businesses, private landowners, farmers, I mean, and the ESG standards for lots of businesses, I mean, that is going to help. I was just sort of reading some stuff in preparation for today, and Mark Carney from the UN has been talking about the value and rewards of investing in net zero climate solutions, and that is a fantastic opportunity. Robbie, do you see that from where you're sitting? Does this seem to you to be a welcome move forward?
Well, I didn't touch on green finance yet, but it is important to stress, I think, whilst the market for carbon is in its infancy, there's no shortage of interest from private investors who will be fundamental to helping land managers make that transition. I think the challenge for us and others is to identify the revenue streams for investors, not just from carbon, but link them to those that manage the resource, i.e. the land managers. So I think there's a real opportunity for government and business to come together and align to create the type of investment opportunity for people to thrive, and nature and climate will benefit as a result.
Okay, and Joe, Graham mentioned carrot and stick there. So, the carrot perhaps is this opportunity to invest to offset your carbon. And the stick, I mean, planning, does there need to be more input from the planning side of things?
Well, certainly, I think as a public sector body, we certainly have climate change targets that we have to meet as a public body. So that's, if you like, that's a stick for us. Quite apart from the need to do something about climate change, because we're seeing it happening all around us. So, we're seeing as a business, and we are public sector, but we are also a business. We're certainly seeing the impacts of climate change on our business, things like tree disease, like landslips and like flooding, this kind of thing. So, from a very business-like perspective, I think land managers are starting to take this seriously, not just in the public sector, but all land managers. I would also say on the green finance, we've done a deal with Shell, and they are investing in projects on the national forests and lands, in tree planting and in peatland restoration. They very much are foreseeing what Graham described as very much a need to show what they're doing on climate change, show that they are investing in carbon sequestration, and they're also very much looking for projects which tick the boxes in terms of the nature emergency. They want to be seen to be doing the right thing there as well. So I certainly support what you said, Graham, that land managers and the private sector, I think, can work together really well on this, because there is money, there is desire to do something about climate change. And I think working together, we can actually develop some really exciting projects that do carbon sequestration, but also nature-based solutions, tackling the biodiversity crisis at the same time.
I like the sound of those exciting projects. Robbie, are you sort of working away in the background with these same sort of ideas?
Yes, Nick, and I think just to build on that, we can't stand still. Change is needed, and I think COVID-19 has hammered home that lack of resilience. The virus has hit every part of our lives: health, well-being, education, finance, relationships, family, friends, prospects, and that reach is global, and I think has also exposed some of the social inequalities we've got. So even though many have come to value being outdoors and securing solace from nature, a lot of people simply can't get to decent green space in Scotland. And on a more fundamental point, I mean, the pandemic originated from an unhealthy relationship between the human world and the natural world, which can, as we've seen, can lead from disease jumping and mutating from species to species. And that same unhealthy relationship is also contributing to the degradation of nature across the world. Therefore, I think for me, it follows that ensuring society is more resilient against future pandemics must involve tackling both climate and nature. So that's the big picture, that's the big message I think we all probably get, but we all need to make that happen and probably turn that into reality a little bit more closer to home.
Okay, so we're in a situation where it is at crisis point. Do we agree, all of us, that we are at crisis point? I know prominent people like Chris Packham, for example, that lots of moves, and I think your organisation as well, I think Nature Scott as well, have said there has to be, as well as a climate crisis, we have to officially recognise that there is a nature crisis. Is that the case, Robbie, Joe, Graham? Who would like to go first on that? What about you, Graham?
Well, listen, I think now that the tabloids are launching their own agendas in climate change and the emergency, I think that probably almost answers the question of outright. It seems to me it's unquestionable that there is an emergency and something needs to be done. But I also think the important thing around it is that we've got a growing public awareness of it and a growing groundswell of opinion behind it, and I think the tabloids and others are getting on the back of that. So yes, there is a crisis, but actually I think the first step to actually fixing it is recognising it.
So the first step to fixing it, there is a crisis. First step to fixing it is recognising it. Let's say that we've all recognised it. What's the next step? What is the next best thing to do? Joe, how would you like it to be?
For me, I think we have to work on this at scale where we can, particularly in the context of the audience we're talking to today. We are talking about big projects, big land management projects, big land use change. Now, I think everybody has a role to play, however small. So I think that's really important that we all have a role to play. But in the context of today, I think we all have an opportunity to make a really big difference and work together across land uses and land management types and between land managers. So for me, that's where I'd like to see us starting, is to move out of our own boxes and looking at our own land and looking at Scotland as a whole and what we can all do together. We're working with partners in places like the Cairngorms, where we're working with mainly other public sector land managers at the moment, people like Nature Scott, but also with NGOs like the RSPB and also private landowners alongside. And we can make a real difference if we work at scale on some of these solutions. So I think that's where I think we should start if we're talking about what do we do in Scotland.
Robbie, collaborative working at scale to find common solutions. Does that sit well with you? Nature Scott, you're obviously working together, as Joe said, in the Cairngorms National Park and I guess elsewhere.
Yes, it absolutely does. I agree with Graham and Joe, and we are in an emergency, and plus we mustn't convey a sense of panic. I think we've got to recognise that and act accordingly. I said, nature is our most precious asset, and we know we need to up the ante, both to protect it and indeed to enhance it. Agricultural reform is underway. There are changes afoot to the regulation and management of our uplands. Alignment is key here from a policy perspective, including the extent to which government commitments to climate change will drive economic strategy, regional economic partnerships, the national planning framework, the spatial strategies, land use partnerships. All of that needs to come together, and I don't underestimate the challenge of that. But in the interim, there's lots of really good work going on to deliver those nature-based solutions. Joe's mentioned woodland restoration and creation. We've touched on peatland restoration, urban green infrastructure, and a great range of marine, coastal, agricultural, wetlands enterprises, all of which are using nature, I think, to help tackle some of these challenges. But we need to do more. And I think as we all awaken to the importance of natural capital, we need to place greater value on how that's managed. And that's why Scottish Government are ramping up and committing to multi-year investments with £250 million over 10 years for peatland restoration, an additional £150 million over the next 5 years in forestry to support the economy, net zero goals. So there's an awful lot happening, and it does require that partnership working and operating at scale if we're going to make a difference.
Is it enough? Graham? No, Robbie, you're smiling at that. Is it enough? You're laughing at that. Is it enough?
Well, I don't think we should underestimate the challenge here. I think everybody probably needs to think nature in all of our actions. It's not something that's done by others. It's part and parcel of what we all do every day. And wider transformation of land use requires a real culture shift and a behavioural change, and that will take time. We need to take people with us here because we're relying on farmers, foresters, estate managers, gamekeepers to help deliver, and behavioural change is difficult. But so place-based collaborations will be key, community planning partnerships will be key, regional land use partnerships will be key, and I don't want to underestimate the challenge of making difficult decisions for competing claims on land. So I'm optimistic, though. I think we can do it. We've got a 10-year window, I think, to really make that difference, but we need to start now.
We have an audience of people who are working in or interested in renewables. So what is the message? What is the best message or the top key thing to say to them? Graham, can we start with you?
We touched on some of the challenges I think around that renewables perhaps has had historically in relation with nature and with the environment. Now, I think what we can see is a lot of lessons coming through from the renewable sector in connection with how they have adapted to nature and how working now collaboratively, to use Joe's expression earlier, with nature and with the regulators. Some of the peatland projects that are on, or some of the wind farm projects that are now going on peatland, are actually not only creating renewable energy, but also actively restoring peatland at the same time. So we are really seeing, I think, a more joined up approach, and I think that must and will continue. I'm not sure beyond that. There's an awful lot I would really say, unfortunately.
Joe, you were nodding there. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I'm just reflecting on my experience with the forestry sector. I think one of the things, and also Robbie's comment about culture change, I think one of the things that we're going to have to be thinking about is the sort of the holistic impacts that renewables have. So just thinking of the forestry sector, I think there has been a little bit of a tendency in the past to think, well, we do forestry, so we don't have to worry about climate change because trees are good, aren't they? So therefore, we just grow trees, carry on business as usual, and that's the climate change box ticked. But actually, it's much more complex than that. And we have to change the way we do forestry. We have to think about forestry differently to the way we would have done in the past, perhaps. And I think renewables is perhaps the same, whereby because renewables are are avoiding emissions by decarbonising the electricity sector, there may be a temptation to think, well, we're ticking the climate change box, aren't we, because we're doing renewables. And I think we have to stand back and think holistically about what the turbines are replacing and how all the infrastructure associated with renewables has an impact, and really work on minimising that impact at the same time as doing the positive things that renewables can do. So I think for me, it's a bit like what we've done in forestry. I think we have to stand back and look much more holistically at the industry that we're in, rather than just think, well, it's trees, it's good, isn't it? Or it's turbines, it's good, isn't it?
I think what was interesting is the story a couple of weeks ago about the coal mine being given planning permission in Cumbria, and the manager there, or somebody there, standing up in the news at 6 o'clock and saying, well, actually, this is needed. We need this coal because otherwise we can't create our own wind turbines. We need this as a fuel to create the steel, to create wind turbines. So nothing is in isolation, is it? Everything is a massive impact. There's, whether you're talking about needing a fossil fuel to create the steel, to create a renewable source of energy, or you're talking about the impact of erecting a wind farm onto peatland, and the impact that might have, or the impact on the environment of, well, we have to build this structure to bring offshore wind onshore and convert it to the clean electricity that we need. Everything is interconnected. So it's a case of the big picture. Robbie, we have to look at the big picture, don't we?
Yeah, we do, and I mean, I'm again kind of glass half full kind of guy, and I am quite optimistic that we can continue to protect and enhance Scotland's natural capital at the same time as driving a thriving renewables industry. There are some risks in all of that. Of course, we understand them, and the risk, as you've highlighted, is they go from one extreme to the other. We can't have renewable energy at all costs. We need to have renewable energy alongside nature. It can't be one or the other, and we need to learn and find the win-win solutions rather than the trade-offs. But I think we can do that. I think the other thing, just to note here in terms of what we can learn from what's gone before, the land use targets within the climate change plan are really ambitious. And can we meet that ambition, whether it's for peatland restoration or woodland planting? Those challenges are huge, and there are questions of capacity and skills and the sheer scale of the task. So for peatland restoration, for example, creating an industry from scratch. But there's real opportunities here too. So again, context, nature-based jobs grew at probably 5 times the rate of all jobs in Scotland over the last 5 years, and accounted for 1/3 of all job growth in Scotland over that period. So I think nature-based jobs are just emerging in some sectors. Urban green infrastructure, green finance, these are all growth areas, and I think those, we can expect those to develop quickly as demand for those roles grows. So I think we can turn this into a real positive opportunity to get to net zero and make sure that we have a natural economy, and that's a really good opportunity for Scotland to be world leading.
And of course, what we're seeing at the moment is a massive downturn in jobs in industries like oil and gas. So how serendipitous would it be to be able to redeploy a lot of those people and get those skills and skill people up again to work in nature for the overall benefit of our country and that target of a full green recovery. We're reaching the end of our time. We're coming a little close to that. What I'd like you to do, if you possibly can, is just summarise from your own perspectives how our audience today, the renewables industry, can help come together to beat these twin emergencies, I guess, of climate emergency and the nature emergency. Would you like to go first, Jo?
I think it's going back to what I said before. It's about seeing this holistically, and I think if the renewables industry can take a step back and recognise its role, not just in creating decarbonised energy, but also in tackling the nature crisis, and can make its decisions on that basis, I think that the developments that take place could be a net positive for biodiversity, with restoring peatland around them, creating woodlands, minimising the impact. So I think the way that I would see renewables having their role is to continue to do what they do, but to make sure they do it holistically and see the big picture as they focus on energy.
Thank you. Yes, that's just captures it beautifully. Graham.
Well, I perhaps turn it around slightly. I actually think the renewable sector can actually offer quite a lot in relation to decarbonisation and actually the journey over the last 20 years. So, we have a vast resource that was identified in terms of wind and wave, with a supportive regime put around it, wrapped around it. We had subsidies, making it financially attractive for investment and private sector involvement. And then we had this ongoing realization that this form of development was both sustainable and cleaner. So I think that all chimes very, very nicely with what I think is going to be decarbonisation and nature-based solutions going forward. In terms of lessons learned, perhaps I think one of the key things, and Robbie touched on it earlier, is really a strong policy focus and direction which will allow markets to develop around about that. And again, we can see that coming through from renewables. And I think its certainty is going to be essential here, not chopping and changing, and allowing stakeholders to structure businesses around plans and targets and then really capture these opportunities.
Fantastic. So I'm hearing a lot of positivity here, which I have to say, when we started talking about 25 minutes ago, I wasn't expecting. Robbie, you've been positive throughout. Finish us on a high.
Here you go. So I think in the short term, we've all got to learn from the awful impacts of this pandemic, haven't we? We're all feeling the need to do something different, and we need to shift, I think, from that model where we continually extract from nature, depleting its capacity to support itself and us, to one where we support nature in a restorative and generating economy. I think we can do that, but we as individuals must take responsibility. The collective, whether it's companies, communities, governments, or international institutions, must all step up. So I think we've all got a role to play.
We've all got a role to play, and we all need to step up, but there are lessons to be learned and there are job opportunities. Thank you so much. I have learned an enormous amount in the last 25 minutes. Really appreciate your input. Robbie, Joe, Graham, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And bizarrely handing back to myself from the dining room to us live here in the studio today. Thank you so much to Robbie and Joe and to Graham for their input there. And as I mentioned, both Robbie and Graham will be available just after the next session for any of your questions and comments. So please keep them coming in. On that front, Rob Gibson's been in touch. Now, unfortunately, Joe from Forestry and Land Scotland can't join us today, but here's a comment from Rob, which an interesting and a different angle on it. Forestry and Land Scotland needs to transfer forest land that's unfit for automated harvesting methods. Can this be sold to give best value for communities to go about cutting climate gas emissions and putting power into local hands that can be much more focused than a big corporation on building environmental diversity? Interesting viewpoint there, Rob. We will make sure that that is fed back, and it's good to have all of your comments. David, I can see you've popped up back on my screen again. It's time to hand back to you. Nice to see you again. Hand time back to you to learn from best practice from our European neighbours. I know that all of your panellists are waiting in the wings, so I shall let you crack on.
Okay, thanks, Nikki, and thanks everyone for joining us for this session within SHREC, where we'll be bringing an international element to the conference. So I'd first of all like to introduce my two panellists this afternoon. The first is Jorunn Sandvik, who is joining us from Norway. Jorunn is a partner in the Norwegian law firm Havynd, specialising in renewable energy work. So welcome, Jorunn. And the second is David Scrimger, who is the principal of DS Consulting, a Scottish lawyer who's been living and working in Munich for the last 30 years and has been heavily involved in strategic links between companies in Scotland and Germany. So welcome to you, David. And over the next 30 minutes, we'll be hearing about how renewable energy has developed in their countries, how those countries are transitioning to deal with the climate change emergency, and hearing also about some particular technologies which are also important for Scotland. So just to get started right away, Jorunn, could you start by telling us a bit about Norway's energy split between renewables and oil and gas, and what sort of renewable technologies have been developed up to now?
Yeah, sure, David. Thank you, and thanks for having me on the conference. Electricity production in Norway is actually 98% renewable. So it's the highest share in Europe. So it's a good starting point for Norway there. It's about 150 terawatt hours a year altogether. This includes largely hydropower. Hydropower, of course, is a big part of how Norway is built overall. And then we have the onshore wind. It's about 90% hydro and 10% onshore wind as of today. I think it's important on hydro to mention that this is to a large extent adjustable production through the use of reservoirs. We are kind of lucky that way. So this implies storage possibilities where production quickly can be adjusted up and down against demand. So, and at the same time, this is of course a good match for non-adjustable production such as wind power. On onshore wind, this has been growing rapidly over the last 6 to 8, maybe 10 years. It's 10% now, but there's a lot under construction. So during this year, there will be 50% of the total production in Norway. I've been listening a bit to the conference, and I hear that we have some of the same challenges on wind power. Wind power, onshore wind in Norway is actually paused now due to protests. So we have a quite strong, what should we call it, is an impact on local nature versus the climate threat debate going on. It's been quite intense. So let's see how this will be. As of now, the onshore wind is on a pause, I would say. So and the last thing I would like to mention now is that Norway is to a large extent electrified already. We use electricity in private households, so there's very little gas used for heating in private households. So I guess that's different from most other countries. Also in the transport sector, especially for normal cars, we have electrification to a large extent. As a curiosity, I can mention that last year the most sold car in Norway was an electrical car. It was the Audi e-tron, and the year before it was the Tesla Model 3. So that's kind of special, I guess. And we also have quite a few oil and gas facilities electrified already. Thank you.
Okay, that's interesting. So some areas are obviously well ahead of us, Joran, and some perhaps behind us. David, afternoon, turning to you. So could you really answer the same question and tell us a bit about how renewables have developed in Germany?
Hi, thanks for inviting me, David, and hello to everyone from sunny Munich at the moment. I need to put this in context. We're talking about Norway, we're talking about Scotland. This is about Germany, which has a population of 82 million. So the numbers are large, or they signify large numbers. So for example, 46% of electricity demand in Germany comes from renewables as compared to 90 or over 90, as we've just heard from Norway. That's 17% of total energy demand from renewables, which is quite comparable with 21% in Scotland. The issues in Germany in the so-called Energiewende, which is the energy transition that's been going on since the early 2000s, are really about decarbonising heat, so the same problem as we have in the UK. And a particular issue in Germany is decarbonisation of industry, which is responsible for about 20% of Germany's CO2 emissions. In terms of the way onshore wind has developed, it was actually really fueled by the automotive component industry moving into manufacturing components for turbines. So as everybody in this session probably is aware, there's a huge number of turbines produced in Germany by companies like Siemens, Nordex, Enercon. Currently, there's 55 gigawatts of onshore wind installed in Germany, 5 gigawatts offshore, comparable to 8 gigawatts in Scotland, 1 gigawatt offshore in Scotland. So I think you have to look at two aspects to the onshore wind side of things, and offshore now, is that you have the installed wind in Germany, but you have huge amounts of installed wind using the German exported turbines. In terms of solar, that's about 10% of power demand in Germany. It was a manufacturing success in the beginning, but China overtook that in terms of cost. There's been a very successful rollout of products for residential use, so energy systems for houses, especially in the southern part of Germany, and that's still increasing. Biomass is kind of done. It's a huge development in Germany. There are 14,000 biomass plants. It was heavily subsidized. That's also producing about 10% of the renewable power supply in Germany. But in that case, there are increasing issues with nitrates and with land use for feedstock causing problems. So I would say in general, the onshore wind, which is the key development to date, has serious problems, as in Norway to a lesser extent. Fortunately in Scotland, There is a lot of NIMBYism and opposition to onshore wind. The other key problem for the part of Germany where I live is that there are no interconnectors yet to bring the existing and planned offshore wind power down to southern Germany, where the bulk of industry is. So there's a risk of an energy crunch in the coming years. And as I'll speak about later, hydrogen is a possible solution for this coming energy crunch. Thanks.
Okay, that's helpful background. Thanks, David. And yes, we'll certainly come back to hydrogen, which is of interest over here. So turning back to you, Joran, how are things now changing in Norway as we all try to move towards decarbonisation?
So I think one key strategy in Norway is further electrification, right? So especially within the sectors of transport, the process industry, and of course also within oil and gas. Another key strategy would be to and this is becoming quite clear now from the government, is to transform the service and supply industry related to oil and gas towards renewables or the green industries, to put a name on it. And of course to be able to use the technology and the competence within oil and gas in a further development of renewables, not just in Norway, but in a global market. And of course, this is also about securing the employment in today's oil and gas industry. And I think as a result, we see growing focus on offshore wind, and especially within floating offshore wind, that uses much of the same competence and technology that is used in oil and gas today. We also see quite a lot of focus on CCS and carbon capture and storage, and that is also linked to oil and gas and the existing competence of this within this sector today. You mentioned hydrogen. That this is also kind of a third example in Norway as well. Both green hydrogen produced by wind power and to some extent also hydropower, and blue hydrogen produced by Norwegian natural gas, but then combined with CCS to reduce the total emissions. So this is kind of what we see as a result of the strategy. If we turn to oil and gas as of today, I would say that the pace of extraction of oil and gas is more or less the same for now. However, the government, I think it was yesterday, they predicted a decrease, naturally decrease in production of oil and gas with 65% in Norway towards 2050. So that this is how they see the development within extraction of oil and gas in the North Sea. But as I mentioned, is also quite a lot of focus on low emissions in the production of oil and gas. And an example is electrification of the installations in the North Sea. We have seen a lot of it already, and I think it will be also more to come during the next years, replacing then the gas turbines in the North Sea.
Okay, thanks, Joran. You mentioned carbon capture and storage there, and I'm sure our Scottish audience would be interested to hear more about how Norway is developing in that area. I mean, over here, the UK government in a recent energy white paper committed to investing $1 billion in state-of-the-art CCS and 4 industrial clusters by 2030, but we're coming from quite a long way back. So could you tell us a bit about how it's developed in Norway?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. So as you probably know, this is not a brand new technology. It's been used in the oil and gas industry in Norway since the mid-90s, but then in more of a small scale. So I would say that CCS is a good example of utilizing technology from oil and gas to fight the climate change. In Norway, this has been a discussion a very long time, and several governments has tried to realize what you can call a full-scale CCS project in Norway. We call it the Norway's moon landing of all things. So today's government now seems to succeed in their moon landing with a project named Longship in Norwegian. So this is the largest climate project in the Norwegian industry ever. And for now, it includes carbon capture at a cement factory and a waste handling facility in eastern Norway. In all, this includes 800,000 tons of CO2 per year. So the Longship project also includes, together with the capturing process, also transport and storage of the CO2 in a joint project between Equinor, Shell, and Total. So these three companies, they will transport the captured CO2 to a terminal at the west coast of Norway, and from there the gas will be pumped through pipelines to a reservoir beneath the seabed in the North Sea for storage. So I think it's 2,600 meters below the seabed. I think that was a number. So it's a quite exciting project.
Yeah.
So, but it's costly also. So the total cost is 2.5 billion euros. So it's not cheap. And the project will receive a state aid of 1.7 billion euros. So the industry will own and operate this project, and the Norwegian state will provide sufficient support then to get the job done. I think, and it's said several times from the government as well, a very important aim in this is to connect also other carbon capture facilities across Europe to the storage facility in the North Sea. So this is stressed by the government that this is something that other countries in Europe must follow and take use of this technology being developed in this Longship project. It's crucial for the overall success of the project. So I know that there are several discussions on this between the Norwegian government and governments of other countries. And also, it's worth mentioning that this project is supposed to pave also the way for clean hydrogen, because it facilitates the production of blue hydrogen from natural gas and then combined with CCS. So that is also a part of the thinking and the rationale behind this.
Okay, that's really interesting, and if we've got time in the Q&A, we can maybe pick up a bit more about that. But you've neatly linked us into hydrogen, Göran, which David mentioned earlier. And there's been a lot of publicity in the UK here over the last year on hydrogen, David. It's an area where government think long-term jobs can be established, yes. But it's not straightforward. And I just wonder if you could tell us about how Germany is going about trying to make progress in this area.
Yeah, happy to do that, and perhaps also make a connection to Scotland in that regard. I mean, it's a fascinating development. There's a lot of discussion worldwide, and there's a lot happening. Everybody's learning. Prices are coming down just as they have with solar and wind in the past, and predictions are that will continue. There was a recent Hydrogen Council McKinsey report came out that there have been $300 billion worth of hydrogen projects announced to happen up to 2030, with $80 billion worth of hydrogen projects already underway. So that just really shows you, that what's happening in various parts of the world. And Germany, like Scotland, is very serious about developing a hydrogen economy. And interestingly, both Germany and Scotland have the same targets in terms of electrolyzer capacity, so generating capacity, which is 5 gigawatts by 2030. And just to put that in context, the largest electrolyzer operating at the moment in the world is a 20 megawatt facility. I think it's in Austria. So you've got a huge way to go. In Scotland, I think, I think it's certainly if it's a megawatt, it's a real lot. So the strategy commitment from the German government is 9 billion to be invested over the next 4 years, which is a massive amount of money. And it's already kicking off multiple demonstrator projects all over Germany of different kinds. However, the issue for Germany, as I've already said, is that there is no sufficient renewable energy to produce the amount of hydrogen, green hydrogen, that will be required by 2050. So the expectation is that 70% will have to be imported. And there are already discussions going on by the German government with countries such as Morocco, other African countries, Chile, Middle East, and so forth. 2 billion of that 9 billion from the German government is allocated to developing international partnerships, which is the reason that Scotland and Scottish Development International, Scottish Government, have got very excited about the potential for delivering green hydrogen, blue hydrogen to Germany. However, I personally have lots of questions about how that may work. We're talking really long-term scale until there's hydrogen production at scale from offshore wind in Scotland, with the repurposing of pipelines to take it to continental Europe. And the questions that arise are, how is it going to be transported? What will the competition in 10, 15 years look like? What's the pricing going to be? And there's also a point picking up on the Norwegian example. Blue hydrogen is not exactly welcome here in Germany. It's accepted, but it's seen by Germans as rather like nuclear power. You take the nasty stuff and stick it underground and hope that nothing happens. So green hydrogen is really the focus of the German government. So in my view, in terms of this commitment by Germany and the cash that they're putting into these developments, and that cash will continue to flow. And I think there is an opportunity for Scotland to participate in this German import opportunity, but also to benefit from the world leadership, effectively, which Germany has on exporting of hydrogen technologies. So Germany is the largest exporter in the world of electrolyzers and related plant equipment. So I think, what has to happen in Scotland, as I said, we're very at the beginning of this journey with hydrogen. We need to start producing green hydrogen for local use. For example, the whiskey industry is actually very interested in replacing fossil fuels with hydrogen or derivations of hydrogen. And there's an ongoing project, as you may be aware, at Port of Cromarty Firth, the so-called NOSH project, North of Scotland Hydrogen project, which is looking at supplying local distilleries with hydrogen with an electrolyzer based at the port. And I think the advantage of kicking this off domestically will be that we can start to build knowledge, build a supply chain, and be in a good position for exporting at scale when that is possible. I would say, that it's important in this regard that we do more work with German companies. We make Germany more aware of the good stuff that's been happening in Orkney and Aberdeen and so forth. We haven't really been marketing our capability or our interest to any great extent. Norway, on the other hand, there was recently a webinar here in Munich with the Hydrogen Association by the German-Norwegian Chamber of Commerce, promoting a number of really interesting projects to German companies. And I think that was quite a successful event. So there's a lesson to be learned there for Scotland. So as I say, this is really the last point. Our best role in this regard at this moment in time, I believe, is to really offer Scotland as a test bed and a demonstrator opportunity for German technology partners, for example, to produce low carbon fuels from hydrogen. Marine fuels, for example, is going to be a huge industry, and I know that Norway is already quite active in this field. And I think just to give a Highlands and Islands example of the potential, I think the Orion project in the Shetland Islands has a fantastic opportunity to both provide green hydrogen for community hubs, which is the plan of the Shetland Islands Council, and at the same time to help to decarbonise the oil and gas industry, first of all in Shetland and then more widely. And I think the Orion project is a great concept, and for those that don't know about it, it would be worth taking a look at what they're planning to do there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, David. And I hope the Scottish Government are listening to you, some good ideas for business development over here. The last topic I wanted to touch on this afternoon is something you mentioned earlier, Euron, which is floating offshore. Again, it's an area which the UK government are targeting in its recent energy white paper. And obviously, we've already seen the floating offshore demonstration project, which was developed off Peterhead by Highland, which was majority owned by a Norwegian company. So can you tell us a bit about the progress being made in Norway on floating offshore?
Yeah, of course. This is something we see a huge focus on right now, and especially over the last year. I think politically, and it's often where it starts, this is a part of the strategy to transform the oil and gas service and supply industry in a green direction, as mentioned, and to secure employment. So I think this focus on offshore wind and especially on floating wind, it's not about increased electricity production. That is not the main goal. The main goal is to facilitate, for what I mentioned, to transform the oil and gas sector and to secure employment. So, as you mentioned the Hywind Scotland project. What we have under construction now is the floating Hywind Tampen project in Norway. It's owned by Equinor, same company that's in the Scottish project. So it's based on the same technology as the 30 megawatt Hywind Scotland project, and it's it's phase 2, to call it that, for the Scottish project. So it's 88 megawatt, and it's intended to provide electricity to 2 specific oil and gas facilities in the North Sea, Snorre and Gullfaks platforms. So altogether, it will remove 200,000 tons of CO2 per year. It will be the world's largest floating offshore wind farm and the world's first floating wind farm to power offshore oil and gas facilities. And the idea is, of course, to not stop here, but continue to develop this technology. So it's funded with 230 million euros by the Norwegian state, and I think it's important to be aware that this is not the subsidies is not related to the production, but it's the technology development. That's the focus for the subsidies. So it's supposed to be, I think it's on time. It's supposed to be commissioned in the third quarter of next year. While this is going on, 2 other offshore wind areas are also opened in Norway. I think we are a bit behind Scotland on this. I have to admit that. So they opened up 1st of January this year. So there's one area for floating technology, I would say, 1500 megawatt, and it's a second area that is more suitable for bottom fixed installation, 3000 megawatt. And at the same time, new regulations on offshore wind came into force in Norway. It's been a tremendous interest for these areas, and projects are popping up everywhere, and we see many interesting alliances being formed to apply for licenses within these 2 areas. And of course, I think that the players there, they are running a bit too fast, because the regulatory framework around this in Norway is still in the making, I would say. It's a bit too early, but I think the government is doing the best they can, and I think they were taken a bit by surprise to see the interest for this. I think there will be no auction-based licensing system in Norway on this. It will be more of a qualitative system, the same as we have on onshore wind, and that is different from many other countries. And it's important also to emphasize that there is no subsidies offered in this, but still the interest is huge. So it's no subsidies, at least related to production of electricity. Any subsidies you can get is related to the development of this new technology, and of course, in particular to the floating projects. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Göran. I appreciate time has been relatively short, but that's been really interesting to hear from you on three specific topics there, to both of you. Nikki, how are we dealing with questions? Are you back on? Do you have any questions? Are we doing this jointly with the previous panelists? Do you want me to ask the question in the interim?
David, I am here. I don't know if you can hear me. Yes, I can see myself, so I'm hoping that at least somebody can hear me. Thank you very much, gentlemen, all three of you. That was an incredibly interesting discussion, and really good to hear the other, just how anyone else is doing it. I do have some questions, and in fact, one for you. If I can just find this, Göran, from a fellow Norwegian who is living in the Highlands of Scotland. And this is from Tor Jurstad. Tor says, when I was looking up which countries produce the most renewable energy, Germany came first. You'll be very proud of that, David. But Norway wasn't in the first 10. And then I found the 98% statistic for Norway that you mentioned. Why is there discrepancy in that statistic? Now, I don't know if you have an answer for that, but if you do, then we'd love to hear it. Putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, I guess that's depending on if you look at the percentage or the terawatt hours being produced.
Of course. So that's where the discrepancy comes there. It's the percentage.
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay, because David was giving you a great thumbs up there for marketing beautifully to Germany, but not necessarily to the rest of the world. But Tor, I hope that answers your question. Tor has another question, and this time it's for David. If the UK had the political will in the past, could the UK currently be on a par with Germany for renewables? Again, maybe an unfair question to give you, but you may have some insight there that the rest of us don't, that you're willing and happy to share.
I think there's probably two reasons why that's pretty unlikely. One would be the financial side of things. I mean, the development of onshore wind was heavily subsidized, and bill payers are still stumping up for that, quite unhappily, actually. Huge cost to electricity users, but a great result. And I guess the other reason is what I said earlier, that you have fantastic engineering capabilities in Germany, and all these products and all this equipment has to be imported into the UK, whereas in Germany, you make it here, you build it here, you install it here. And I think, those are things that are just political will on the financial side, I guess, but you can't create a manufacturing industry, from a low base, which is what
you can't do it from scratch overnight. Yeah, really good point there. Thank you very much for that. John Bedwell has been in touch. Just before we invite our panelists from the previous discussion in, I'll just leave this one out, throw this one out there. John Bedwell's been in touch. Much talk about macro scale investment in green hydrogen, and earlier issues about getting the growth in wind power to where it's needed, grid issues example. Is there not a case for many more micro scale projects as a potential to deal with the use and distribution of energy on a much more localised basis for home heating and transport? Any volunteers to jump in for that one?
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, I would just refer back to what I said about the Orion project. on Shetland, which is exactly that, or you could look at what they've been doing in Orkney. I think there is very much a case for that, and there is equipment available and companies manufacturing electrolyzers at smaller scale than, say, Siemens is making, which would be very suitable, just like is being done in Aberdeen on transport. So without a doubt, it needs to begin as a domestic industry in Scotland and then expand to be a scale industry.
To begin as domestic and then expand for scale. Thank you very much for that. I hope that answers your question. Thank you for that. I'd like to invite now, just widen the discussion a bit, if we may, and invite Robbie Kernigan and Graham Nisbet from the previous discussion. I'm just hoping that they'll pop up on my screen, and yes, there they are. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Is Robbie there as well? Just joining, and there he is. Great. Great to have you on board, and thank you very, very much for joining us. I hope you've been enjoying as much as you have been able to of the conference today. I'm going to dive right in with a question, if I may, for Robbie and Graham, but any of you may join in if you wish with this. It's from Lloyd Edwards, and it's about, well, I'll just read the question. Given the huge CO2 emissions from wetlands and former wetlands, grouse moors and farming, is there more that the Scottish Government can do here? Robbie, I'm going to throw that one at you first up. Nature Scott.
Is there more we can do in relation to land use and climate change? Is that broadly?
I guess that's what the question is. Yes.
Well, hopefully from our discussion earlier, you will have picked up that there is an awful lot we can, should, and probably must do if we're going to get to these very challenging targets by 2030. Quite a lot of the discussion today, rightly so, has focused on renewables and all of the progress that we have made in Scotland and more widely in renewables. But as we continue to make inroads into energy and transport and housing and all of those things which we referenced earlier, the focus does come into land use and farming and agriculture. And I think that's one of the reasons I've focused primarily on peatlands in some of our discussion, the importance of peatlands and wetlands and the organic soils in storing, sequestering and preventing carbon emission, hugely important. And whilst peatlands might not be as sexy as trees or turbines, it is hugely important to understand the importance of protecting habitats and soils like peatland, because at the moment, I think the peatland resource in Scotland stores 7,000 metric tonnes of equivalent of carbon dioxide. And as of 2022, when we see the index for those emissions begin to include wetlands, we know that 70% of peatlands in Scotland are actually net emitters. So those issues need tackled, and that needs investment, and it needs investment in land. And hopefully you'll have got a flavour of that through our session.
Yeah, so investment into the quality of these peatlands and wetlands is as important as anything else, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Does anybody else want to come in on that at all? Graham?
Yeah,
yes.
I think, in terms of the investment, or can the public sector do more? I think for me, as I touched on earlier, this is around taking a lead. It's around giving strong policy direction, but the scale of the investment required here, and as Robbie's just touched on, 70% of peatland is degraded in Scotland. The public sector cannot do this on its own. It can't be expected to fund this on its own. And I really do think there needs to be, and there are opportunities around for the public sector, the private sector rather, but I do think there's the private sector does have to play a large part in this, and I believe is genuinely keen to do so.
Can I just ask, we touched in our discussion, Graham and Robbie, about green investment, offsetting emissions by buying carbon credits as great opportunities for companies. But is that not, maybe I'm just being too simplistic, but is that not cheating a bit? Instead of just offsetting by obviously paying for this investment in peatlands and westlands and woodlands, should the focus not be so much more on not emitting in the first place? Is that too simplistic?
Well, no, I'm not sure it's necessarily too simplistic, but I think that most of the emission schemes are a bit of a carrot and a stick. So we have a cap that certain companies and certain industries have to achieve, and that cap gets reduced over time. So emissions will reduce over time, but in the interim, using carbon offset can mitigate against some of the emissions that are still ongoing. There should, all things being equal, it should balance out as technologies develop and get to scale. Again, one of the points that's been touched on already.
Thank you. At the start of the conference today, Rosanna Cunningham was talking about people and communities. Finlay, just before lunch, was talking about the importance of these as well, and how people's rights are right up at the Greenpeace told us that people's rights are right up front and centre of everything that Greenpeace's legal agenda is all about. I'd like to ask what the situation is in Norway and Germany as far as people and communities are concerned. Joran, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, are you then addressing the overall situation on the climate threat or on the renewable projects?
Either or. How would you prefer to answer that?
No, I think it's interesting to see the debate in Norway that has risen over the last couple of years. There seems to be a conflict between the climate threat on the one side and the more local impact on the renewable energy projects on the other side. This has been really hard to handle for the authorities. So it's been a lot of pressure on the Norwegian government to stop projects, also projects that has being under construction. And as a lawyer, we've seen a lot more legal processes. The projects that has been dragged to court, one after the other, in an attempt to stop onshore wind projects and also hydropower projects. And this has been something developing over just the last 2 years. So I think we have a real challenge also in Norway to kind of to draw the big picture, to say, and you touched upon it earlier in the conference, to see how to see the big picture on climate and being able to do something about it locally as well. I don't have the answer on this. It's interesting, and I think it will only develop more and more in Norway to some point, I guess. So that is something that we as lawyers also see and are involved in every day now, and especially on onshore wind.
Yeah, thanks, Joran. It is a big question, and it's an interesting topic, something we could probably have a whole other conference about. David Scrimmager, Germany, what is the situation? How are people and communities being brought along with this move to renewable energies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, one of the reasons that onshore wind developed so rapidly was because it was actually managed by local communities. So a local bank would fund together with, or establish a fund which would be invested in by professionals, typically for a return of 7 or 8%. And that's really how all over Germany, these smaller wind parks developed. So you did have a community effect there. I would say what's happening now is that there is obviously political and emotional reaction to climate change, but I don't see it coming down to community level. In my view, that's partly because the Green Party has kind of lost focus on the whole climate change issue in Germany. And maybe just one last point. I think what Scotland, what the Scottish government does in terms of a just transition is really very striking, because I think it's a topic, certainly, I don't know about Norway, but certainly here in Germany, it's not perceived, climate action is not really perceived as needing to have that element to it. So it's something that Germany and other countries, no doubt, could learn from Scotland. This emphasis on inclusion and a fair transition, I think, is very impressive.
Well, it's nice to see that the learning is not all one way and not all us learning from you. David Bone, I think you had your hand up at one point there. You may just have been adjusting something on your screen, but I was wondering if that was...
No, I was actually going to make a contribution, Nikki. So, no, I think it's interesting. And in some ways, what has been said in Germany and Norway, I think applies in England. And the UK government, certainly the current one and the previous Conservative administration, have struggled with the idea of onshore wind because it's been so unpopular amongst their constituents in Middle England, and therefore have shunted as many turbines offshore as possible. And by continuing to subsidise that, it has achieved the great feat of making the UK a world leader in relation to that. But that's ostensibly why it happened. Whereas in Scotland, there has been a lot more favourable viewpoint of onshore wind. And I think what the Scottish Government are doing, because you don't hear much about this just transition from Westminster, I think what the Scottish Government are doing is really important. What they are saying is we need people and communities to buy into this. We're not just going to push it all down from on high. And if we can get that buy-in, we're going to be a lot more successful. So we're going to ask people what they would like and try and go down that route rather than having the views determined by certain sections of the party. So I think it's an area where Scotland can justifiably be proud, but it's only the start of the process. We have to do a lot more.
It's yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Taking people with you it's always easier to govern people who wish to be governed in that particular direction, and working together with a commonality is always going to produce better results. I've been asked to ask you all this. This is a question that David Bone, I posed earlier when you were in this panel discussion, and this is again from Lloyd Edwards. We were talking about money that has been earmarked for projects. Now, these don't specifically relate to Norway and Germany, but you will be aware perhaps of HS2, the massive amount of investment and money that's going into motorway expansion across the UK and into nuclear energy. Where would you prefer to see the money spent? I'm going to come to you first, Robbie, on this, because I suggest that you may not be in favour of motorway expansion, HS2 and investment into nuclear energy, but perhaps I'm second guessing you.
Well, that's an interesting. I wasn't ready for that one, but I will give you my best. I mean, I think what I did earlier was shamelessly use the opportunity to highlight the links between climate and nature, and I think it is important that those links are explicit and understood, because one of the reasons for doing that for me was that everything that you do for nature is good for the climate, but not everything you do for the climate is necessarily good for nature. And I think that's really important distinction for me, because as I said earlier, we're really looking for win-wins in renewable energy development, but understanding the demand is key to that, and how we secure, I think, good locations for well-designed, viable energy projects whilst increasing, I think, and strengthening our climate resilience and delivering for nature, we can do. But it does require a seismic shift and everybody to ask really difficult questions about where we put nature in the heart of our decision making. I would like us to put it front and centre, and indeed I think we do need to do that. So that would throw questions about actually whether or not we need to expand some of those already earmarked infrastructure projects, or can we do them in a much more nature friendly way.
So nature first. Jorunn, is there the same sort of tug, shall I say, or tussle in Norway?
Yeah, of course, it's the same questions, and of course I would say that we need to realize the good projects. It could be a good wind project, it could be a good hydropower project also in Norway. So it's all about finding the right locations, finding the municipalities that is supportive to the project. And I think we need to admit that in Norway, at least, we have been a bit too quick with positioning the projects in some places that has been wrong. We need to admit that. So there's a consideration now adjusting the regulations to involve at least the municipalities more than before. So that's a good idea.
So it's back to people and places then. And David Scrimmager, Germany, same issues, and anything more to add?
Not really. I mean, I think it's a bit different here because of the federal structure and the size of the country, as I said earlier. So, you know, decisions are made regionally on projects. So you don't tend to get these big national projects that create opposition. It tends to be something you vote on as an elector, as a voter, you know, in your election about what the local regional government is planning to do.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for all your contributions. Thank you for joining us, for your time, for your expertise this afternoon. Really appreciate it. I have got my eye on the clock and I see that we are running a little bit out of schedule. So if I can ask you all, accept our thanks and turn your cameras off. I'll dismiss you from the stage and we shall catch up with you again shortly. Thank you so much. Thank you. It is time now, ladies and gentlemen, for our final session of the day before we sum up and leave you all to network. And quite rightly, I think we're handing over to the next generation who, after all, will be impacted by the climate and nature emergencies far more than we will, simply because they're going to live through them longer. Bruce Adamson is the Children and Young Persons Commissioner for Scotland. In this role, he promotes and protects the rights of children and young people. This is an interest that Bruce has held throughout his entire career. For 20 years, he has worked as a lawyer on children's rights issues and human rights as well. Here, Bruce is in conversation with two of the advisors to his role as the Children and Young People's Commissioner. They are 16-year-old Col McCall from the Borders. Col is passionate about social and climate justice. And Becky White, who is also 16. She's campaigned on climate change and gender equality, and she works with CYPCS to ensure that every child knows their rights and has their rights protected. It's over to you, Bruce, Col and Becky.
Hi, I'm Bruce. I'm the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland. And with me today, I've got Col and Becky, who are two of the young advisors to my office. And this really important discussion we're having about human rights, and particularly recognising the role that young people are playing as leaders in the movement for climate justice. And Col and Becky are two amazing human rights defenders, and so they're going to be doing most of the talking. So I'd like to start by asking you both, is climate change a human rights issue?
I'll go. I think primarily the reason I think it's a human rights issue is because I think climate change is a class issue, and because it's a class issue, it doesn't affect everybody equally, and therefore is a human rights issue. Primarily because of the ability to get involved with the climate movement, is it a class issue? I think that if you don't have the time in your hands, if you can't afford to live economically and in an environmental way, you are cut off. You don't have the time to engage in strikes. You can't do that kind of thing, and we have to combat the kind of exclusion which can happen in that regard. And in that way, climate change is most definitely a class issue, but it's also a class issue because, I mean, if you don't have enough money to get through the week, you don't have the time to think about the melting of the polar ice caps. And then in terms of who it affects, I mean, the global south are going to be the first victims of the climate crisis, despite the fact that it's the global north who have been solely responsible almost for the crisis. We've been plundering southern oil reserves for years, and yet now that these global countries in the global south have the ability to use their oil reserves, we're telling them no and taxing it incredibly so they can't use it. And in that regard, climate change is most definitely a human rights issue.
And Becky, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're going to see in recent and like the years coming that climate change is going to impact people's right to housing. We've seen recently a lot of extreme weather, so we're going to see extreme flooding and increased frequency of natural disasters, which will impact that. And if we look a bit more closer to home, we see that climate change and your right to education are linked. Currently we do not have adequate climate education, so young people aren't able to access their right to education to its fullest extent because they're not learning about the climate crisis, despite the fact it's going to undoubtedly impact their future.
Absolutely, and I think that's hugely important in terms of setting climate change as a human rights issue, and all the work that you've been doing on climate justice and the links between climate change and the right to life and development, cutting through absolutely every aspect of our life and that disproportionate impact that it's having on different parts of the world and different people. Hugely important. So how important is your generation then in the fight for climate justice, Becky?
I think, previous generations have wasted years and years and years with inaction. So I think it really does fall to our generation to stop the inaction and actually take notice and pull up. However, I think what's important to note is that a lot of this generational, the fact it's been left to our generation is unfair because it's not actually our generation that's caused this massive issue. And a lot of the time it feels like we've just been handed this massive burden of climate change and we've been told to fix it. And yet when young people do, like for example, Greta Thunberg, when young people do go to the people in power and say we need to change something, they're not given then the influence or the power to actually make the change they need to make. So it feels that sometimes it's like you want us to change this, but yet you're not giving us the influence in order to do so.
And Cole?
What Becky says is absolutely spot on, and I think that because it falls to our generation to deal with climate change, there's a stigma attached to it, and there is this kind of immense pressure on younger people that young people can no longer be seen to buy kind of aluminium cans of Iron Brew or plastic bottles of Fanta, and you're constantly kind of trying to live your life by like avoiding the looks you get for buying plastic bottles in the co-op, and that puts an immense pressure on us because there's this stigma, and it is our responsibility, but at the same time it's like we need to break down the fact that you're not causing climate change by buying your water bottle. It's like so much has happened before us. We have to remember that when we're kind of living with the pressure upon our shoulders, is the word, to solve the climate crisis. So I think that it's so important that you get involved with the climate movement, despite the fact that you can't buy your plastic bottle.
It's hugely important in terms of, again, one of the frustrating things that I think we sometimes hear is that children and young people are the future or leaders of the future, when in fact you're playing a leadership role right now, and you're full rights holders right now, and where you need to be is in the places where decisions are made, and so not the individual actions that you're taking, but rather being right at the heart of the decision making about the systemic changes that are needed. I think that's hugely powerful. And so what would you say then to the adults who are saying that young people are climate alarmists or making too much of a big deal, or that it's about individual responsibility?
I'd say that firstly, we're most definitely not climate alarmists, but I'd acknowledge that the holding up of banners that say we've got 5 years left on the planet doesn't help. That doesn't help. But at the same time, in the next few years, climate change is going to become a key proponent in everything we do. I mean, talk about a Green New Deal, that's going to affect housing, it's going to affect, as Becky said, it's going to affect so many things. It's going to affect education, building a kind of school programme which involves climate change. When we're building kind of infrastructure and in every part of public policy, climate change is going to play such a huge role, as it should. And to accuse anyone of being alarmist when climate is going to play the role that it hopefully will, that doesn't make sense, because as the years go by, climate change is going to affect every corner of young people's lives and everybody's life. So it's not alarmist to raise the issue in the slightest.
Becky?
I think looking at it from like an individual responsibility, I think like as Cole said, like it is, there's rhetoric we hear a lot about around climate change is that it's all the individual responsibility and that you should buy a bamboo toothbrush and you should make sure you recycle everything, which I think you should be doing and I hope you do. However, I think it's a fantastic rhetoric to peddle when the government has been not doing things and when large corporations are still emitting tons and tons of emissions that are harming the planet. So I think as much as we do need to make our own individual choices, I think we need to look to the root cause of it. And I think, it's not, we shouldn't just like think that things are going to change if the market demands it. We should say it's the government responsibility to put in regulations in place to make sure it changes. And I think that we really need to make sure we get long-standing, systemic, sustainable change instead of just relying on the good nature of people, which is also sometimes, as Cole was saying, it's also a class issue. We can't rely on people cannot afford all these sustainable products. So we need to do something in place to change it so that all products are sustainable.
Can I come in on that just quickly, Bruce? It's just
absolutely, yeah.
Becky's totally right, and the very nature of our economic model just now is expansionary, where capitalism ever expands and it's ever growing, and by that nature, it's despite however many strikes we go on, the complete commercialisation to the detriment of the climate will continue at an ever-growing pace. And whilst the climate industry will be commoditised and kind of the system will lend a hand in battling climate change in solar panels and in wind farms, there will never ever be an alternative in which climate is put at the top of the agenda because of the very nature of global economics at the moment, because global economics in itself relies on the principle of competition, which is so far apart, competition is, from being kind of green and from being fair on climate change. The two are completely contradictory. I think that's so important to note when you're considering the kind of key impact of climate change and causes.
Yeah, just to come in on that, I think like we look at something even like, for example, a phone, like the entire kind of idea around that is that a new one comes out every 2 or so years, which is pretty much identical, maybe a few new features, and people will buy it and get rid of their perfectly usable old phone, or in fact actually slowing down phones. And I think just acknowledging that like the entire system is what's part of the issue, I think is really important.
Absolutely, and I think this links really strongly to the global obligation. So it's not an individual, but it's not even any one government that is going to be the solution to this, but the global community working together. And so we have started to see movement in terms of international law focusing on addressing climate change and starting to bring in mechanisms for climate justice. And obviously a big opportunity later this year, if COVID allows for it to happen, of COP26 and some of those discussions. How do you feel that the international community is doing in terms of taking this seriously and addressing the concerns that you've raised?
I think a lot of human rights bodies like the UN have been really good at recently looking at the human rights-based approach that we can take to tackling climate change and the acknowledgement that it will impact on human rights. I think also, incorporation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child will hopefully happen for Scots law in 2021. So I think once that is in place, it would be interesting to see how that kind of plays out in terms of if it means that we can take more stricter climate policies in a direct correlation to the right to life and the right to a safe environment.
Yeah.
Totally, and I think also that currently climate is fashionable, which means that it's a vote winner. And for as long as climate stays fashionable, there will be international efforts because it's popular, and that's a good thing. But what we have to ensure is that it doesn't become, as so many other issues have, like trans rights, for example. Climate might become the next victim of this. People call it a culture war, to the point if we allow climate to be deemed woke in the same way that other kind of issues like it have been and continue to be, we are in a really dangerous territory where it becomes this polarizing issue where you have kind of reactionaries and progressives on either side of a divide, and rather than uniting young people, climate is this polarized issue which is used to kind of both gain votes and throw them away, and we have to prevent climate from becoming another kind of culture war target, if you like, I think.
Absolutely. I think what you both said there is incredibly powerful in terms of the need to build this within legal systems and mechanisms and understand that this is a universal issue that affects everybody, and shouldn't be subject to the vagaries of politics or popularity, but seen as a fundamental human rights issue. I think that's really powerful from both of you. And so what advice would you then give to other young people who want to join the fight for climate justice? What types of things should they be doing?
Become a young advisor. The Children and Young People's Commissioner's Office. You can apply now online, I believe, or via Twitter. As much as that's a plug, honestly, totally, you should. It's the most amazing opportunity to tackle not just climate change, but a whole range of human rights issues, both affecting children and young people and everyone, and to guide the most incredible office in the right direction. In addition to that, I don't know, Becky, what do you think?
I would say keep on reading, keep on getting, keep on just be aware of the climate crisis, and particularly try to look at it through a human rights angle, which sometimes it isn't looked at through. So I think just learn about your rights and then learn about the environment. And I think what's also important is making sure that you're kind of looking at other countries and what other countries are doing, because a lot of the time we like to think that our country will have the best solution, when actually we can learn a lot from other countries and other countries' approaches. So I'd recommend just reading around and doing as much as you can.
We've also got an election coming up, so read parties' manifesto and read climate commitments, and I don't know, register to vote, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. For those that can vote. And thanks so much, Cole, for the plug for the office, because I've got the best job in the world as Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland, but the best part of that job is working with children and young people, and particularly the role that young advisors like Becky and Cole play in terms of advising me on every aspect of our work, and it's really powerful. And as you've seen from the discussion today, the insight that they can give really changes the way that I do my work. So I would encourage anyone who's in any position of decision making or power to think about how they can involve children and young people in their work, and particularly on some of these issues like climate justice, where young people have really been leading the way. We absolutely have to make sure that children and young people are at the heart of every place where decision is made in relation to business and human rights and climate justice. And so that's a hugely important thing that everyone can do, is think about how to involve children and young people in your decision making and work. And so, Becky and Cole, have you got any kind of final calls to action or words of advice or challenges for those that have been involved in this conference about what adults should do differently? Any final words from either of you or both of you?
I think listen to young people and truly value their views. I think sometimes it's become almost fashionable to involve young people, to the point where it becomes quite tokenistic, and you can write a report and the recommendations might not even be looked at. So I think what's really important is, if you are going to engage with young people, which you should be doing, make sure it's meaningful and make sure you actually are going to take on their ideas and value them. And I think that's especially important for younger people who actually can't vote. So decisions are being made without them taking part in it. Major decisions are happening and they don't actually have a say. I think it's important to remember that these decisions will impact us for the longest time. It is our future. So I think it's really unfair that sometimes it's our future and we're not even getting a say. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Becky. And Cole?
I think don't use young people as a tick box, as Becky says, totally. And bear in mind that the impression you get about young people from the media and from from papers, TV and radio isn't always accurate at all. And that, I think totally that you should be involving young people in everything that you do, as Becky says. And there is real potential there for kind of discussions and engagement, and in building up kind of involvement in current affairs amongst a generation who are already kind of going through a politicisation with climate and with Black Lives Matter over the summer, and these issues are engaging our generation, and it's the responsibility of organisations to build on that engagement by encouraging them into their work.
Well, a fantastic way to end from both of you. So thanks, Becky. Thanks, Cole, for that fantastic discussion. And thanks all of you for watching and for being committed to this issue and seeing climate change as a human rights issue.
Thank you, Becky, Cole and Bruce. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was terrific. And I wasn't alone. Shirley Matheson has been in touch with us through the comment section. So good to hear balanced comments from young contributors. Too often it's the end of the world young view that we are hammered with. Thank you to Harper Macleod for giving them this platform. Well, I think we need to say thank you, yes, to Harper Macleod for giving them this platform, but also thank you to them for taking the time to share their views. Really interesting stuff there. I don't know what you took from that most of all, David, but for me, it was that we need to prevent climate from becoming a political issue that will polarize people and realize that, I suppose, as we have done today, realize that it's a global human rights issue as well. And also, I think Becky said to learn from other countries and other communities, which is exactly what we did just in that last session. What are your thoughts? I mean, on that, but on today as a whole, David?
I've really enjoyed it, Nikki. It's met and to some extent exceeded my expectations. Just thinking through all of the important messages we've heard today. We heard from the Scottish Government on a really positive momentum and wanting to really map out what Scotland could do in climate change and create a really good picture when we get to COP26. I think from Greenpeace and from the young people, the message of there are duties and responsibilities. These are not just aspirations. So governments and businesses have duties and responsibilities. And as Becky said towards the end of her talk there, the engagement has to be meaningful, not just tick box exercises. I think from the session with the developers and investors, for me, they're saying, if the policies are in place, we can bring the projects which will help us achieve our targets. There's a desire to take advantage of Scotland's great natural resources and to build these projects. I think from the session involving nature, very much the message was, nature has a big part to play in this, but we have to think holistically so that you take into account nature and the projects and everything going together. And I thought the session with Joran and David was fascinating. You can always learn from other people. In some areas, Scotland was ahead of them, but in other areas, they had moved so much further ahead by doing things in different ways. So it was really, really interesting. And, just from the last talk, we owe it to the next generation to take the correct action and to meaningfully listen to their views, because it's them who are going to benefit or suffer from the decisions which we make now.
That's exactly it. And it is about meaningful engagement. I think that's maybe one of the things that has come out of the whole of today is meaningful engagement with government, collaboration between different organisations, with communities, with funders, with the whole of the green agenda. And it's just about stopping and thinking and realising what it is that we actually need to achieve if we're going to hit those targets for net zero and get that green recovery. What a day. I think it's going to take an awful long time for all of the learning and all of the thinking to properly settle. But the good news is that it is all available. Let me just summarise for you what's happening now and what is going to happen this evening. That is just about it from us. Thanks to all of our panellists and our speakers. It was great to have so many people involved from so many different sectors and from so many different backgrounds and perspectives. And while we couldn't all be together in one room, I really hope that you felt while you were watching from home or your office or wherever you've been today, that you felt connected to this incredible movement towards a brighter, greener future for us all. Climate change, as we've heard, is an emergency and we have to deal with it. Now we have to deal with it head on, and who better to drive the agenda than our own renewable sector here in the Highlands and Islands. If you missed any of these sections, or if you'd like to watch them again or share them with your own networks, then they will all be available in the Harper Macleod website. Just give them maybe a day or two to get them all chunked up and put up there, and then they'll be also shared on all of the Harper Macleod social media platforms, so look out for them there as well. Take some time to browse around when you're looking at it and share with your own networks as well. If you would like to carry on the conversation this afternoon, then you can head over to the meetings rooms just now. You should have a link available and conversations will continue up until 4 o'clock. That's it from the conference, just about, but it's not it for today. This evening, we really hope that you'll be joining us at the Highlands and Islands Renewable Energy Awards, which kick off on the Hop-In platform, but from right here in this studio in Inverness for 7 o'clock for networking and awards for pre-awards drinks, and then from the stage right here at 7:30. It's not too late to watch the awards. If you'd like to join in and you haven't already signed up to do so, then there will be a URL which will pop up on the screen after we finish. So you can put that into your web browser and get your popcorn ready for 7:30. Thank you so much for your company. I think we've all enjoyed this virtual conference, but we might all really quite enjoy to be back in a room together for SHREC 22. I'm heading home now for a quick shower and a change, and I will be back here. I hope to see you this evening. We're going to be celebrating the best and the brightest talents, companies, projects, collaborations and organisations across the renewable energy sector in the Highlands and Islands. Any final thoughts from you, David?
Just a big thanks, Nikki, first of all, to all our speakers and panellists for all the time they put in, not only today, but in preparation. I know from my own experience, you might only be speaking for 15 minutes, but you can spend hours preparing for that. Thanks very much to you for your usual enthusiasm and professionalism. Oh. And thanks also to the audience for their questions, because that is a big part of the day. And like you, I've really enjoyed it. But if we could get back next year in Inverness, that would be really nice. So let's wait and see. But one way or the other, we'll see you all next year. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, everything crossed, we can be together. Now, I know one or two of you were a little late in joining conference this morning, and maybe you were only able to join us for this afternoon. So here's a reminder of the song that we started with at 12 noon. It's a message that has echoed right throughout all of the conversations that we've had today. It is the climate change song, The Time Is Now.
Large-scale farming plays a big part. Billions of cows means a whole lot of farts.
We need change, it has to be drastic. Cut the production of single-use